The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Every eye in the room was fixed on Judge Sarah Turner as she sat high above everyone else, her gavel poised like an executioner's axe. She had seen her fair share of high-profile cases over the years, but today was different. Today, the name Elon Musk carried more weight than ever before. It had all started a month ago. The charges were simple, at least on the surface. Environmental violations. Musk's company, one of the most influential in the world, had been accused of illegal dumping, a routine regulatory issue that, under normal circumstances, would have been settled quietly with a fine and a settlement. But this was no normal case. Sarah had been a judge for over 2 decades, earning a reputation for being tough but fair. She was no stranger to the pressure that came with high-profile cases, and yet, there was something about this one that gnawed at her. Perhaps it was the sheer power Musk wielded, or perhaps it was the weight of his reputation. In a world where tech moguls were treated like kings, she wasn't sure if the law would truly reach him. As she scanned the room, she noticed how the audience seemed more like spectators at a gladiator match rather than a courtroom. Musk sat in the defendant's chair, as composed as ever, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses that never seemed to leave his face. His legal team, sharp-suited and unflappable, stood behind him. And then, there was Sarah. She had never been starstruck, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the man before her. Elon Musk was not just a tech mogul. He was an icon, a symbol of progress and controversy. He had transformed the way the world thought about space, electric cars, and artificial intelligence. Yet, here he was, facing accusations that could cost his company billions and tarnish his reputation forever. Judge Turner, the prosecution called, snapping Sarah out of her thoughts. The defendant is accused of repeatedly violating environmental regulations, directly impacting communities and ecosystems. We believe a substantial fine is in order, as well as public accountability for the harm caused. Sarah nodded, glancing at the evidence before her. The case was cut and dry, at least on paper. Musk's company had been fined before, and this time, the violation seemed even more blatant. But then again, she knew better than anyone that things weren't always what they seemed. The law was one thing. The reality of the situation was often something else entirely. She looked at Musk's defense attorney, who had already begun to speak, attempting to downplay the severity of the violation. Your Honor, we acknowledge the issue, but we also believe there was a misunderstanding. My client has always operated within the law, and any violations were not intentional. We request that the fine be minimal, and we will work with the authorities to ensure this does not happen again. Musk sat back, his eyes scanning the room with a certain detachment, as though he were observing a chess game rather than a legal battle. He knew what was at stake, but he also knew the game was never just about the immediate outcome. This was a bigger play. As Sarah weighed the arguments, her mind wandered back to something that had been bothering her for days. A question that no one seemed willing to ask. Was this just a simple environmental issue, or was there more to the story? The world had a way of downplaying the complexity of things, reducing them to headlines and sound bites. But the deeper she looked, the more she sensed there was something under the surface, something that could shake the very foundations of the case. She caught Musk's eyes for a fleeting moment, and for the first time, she saw a hint of something unusual. Not arrogance, but something far more calculating. It was as if he was playing a game, one she hadn't yet figured out. The room seemed to hold its breath as Sarah turned to the defense, her voice steady. I have read the evidence, and while I acknowledge the points raised by the defense, I find the violations concerning. The fine will be substantial. I will issue my ruling shortly. The gavel struck. The court adjourned. As the room emptied, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Not by the cameras, not by the public, but by someone far more powerful. She walked out of the courtroom, her mind racing, but her instincts told her something was off. Something was about to happen, and it wasn't just about the fine. Later that evening, Sarah was sitting in her office, sifting through the case files once more when a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called, not looking up. The door creaked open, and she glanced up to find one of her clerks standing in the doorway, a look of surprise on his face. Judge Turner, I think you need to see this. He handed her a tablet. On the screen was a news article titled, Elon Musk fined by federal judge. But there's a twist. Sarah raised an eyebrow, quickly scrolling through the article. It wasn't just about the environmental violation. The headline was about something far more explosive. The article claimed that Musk wasn't just a businessman. The man who had just been fined was also a secret federal prosecutor, one who had been investigating corporate corruption at the highest levels for years. The very people Musk had been fighting against, people who might have been involved in the case, were now targeting him. The article claimed that the violation had been engineered by Musk's enemies, and the fine was part of a larger scheme. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She had just fined a federal prosecutor who had been working to expose corruption on a scale she couldn't even comprehend. She sat back, her mind reeling. What was really happening? And how deep did this rabbit hole go? "Tell me everything you know," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. The clerk hesitated, but she could see the fear in his eyes. "I don't know much, Judge," he said, "but I think Musk is playing a game that none of us understand." As Sarah processed the implications of what she had just learned, she knew one thing for certain. This case was far from over. And the real question was no longer about the fine. The real question was, who was Musk really working for? And what had she just stepped into? She glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight, but sleep was the last thing on her mind. A new chapter in this case was about to unfold, and Sarah Turner had just become part of a story that no one could have predicted. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Judge Sarah Turner sat behind her imposing desk, the weight of her gavel resting on her hand, the symbol of authority. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning, but inside her mind, thoughts were swirling like a tempest. She had always been a woman of reason, of logic, grounded in her belief that justice must be served no matter who stood before her. But today, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. She had spent over 2 decades on the bench, making decisions that impacted lives in ways both large and small. High-profile cases were nothing new to her. She had sentenced drug lords, defended the innocent, and ruled on the most convoluted of legal matters. But this case with Elon Musk, was different. Her office was immaculate, the kind of sterile perfection that spoke of her no-nonsense approach to her work. Her bookshelves were filled with legal texts, but there was also an old photo of her family. Sarah's eyes lingered on it for a moment, a reminder of everything she had sacrificed for her career. She wasn't married, and the quiet ache of loneliness often lingered in her chest. Her parents were long gone, her brother estranged after a bitter falling out years ago. The law was her life now, her guiding light, but it often felt like it was the only thing she had left. She had always been known for her fairness. She was tough but had a heart for the vulnerable. But like any judge, she was not immune to the pressures of the job. And as much as she had built her career on unflinching decisions, this case was chipping away at the very foundation of her resolve. Born and raised in a small town in Ohio, Sarah had always felt a pull toward justice. Her father had been a police officer, a man who believed in the power of right and wrong, and her mother had been a schoolteacher who taught Sarah the importance of knowledge and empathy. Growing up, Sarah had admired her father's sense of duty and her mother's compassion, and it wasn't long before she realized that law, balancing fairness with compassion, was where her own heart lay. She had excelled in her studies, gaining a reputation as the brightest student in her class. After completing law school at an Ivy League school, Sarah made her way to Washington, D.C., where she would begin her ascent in the judicial world. Her career had been defined by one unshakable belief: the law was above all else. That meant no exceptions, no favoritism, no special treatment. Even the most powerful people in the world had to answer to her courtroom. But lately, that belief had begun to fray, and the more she thought about Elon Musk, the more she wondered if there were things she didn't yet understand about him, about the law, and about the world they lived in. Her clerk's words echoed in her mind. Musk is playing a game none of us understand. The idea had unsettled her deeply. She had found a man who had been working in the shadows as a federal prosecutor. How had she missed that? How had she gotten it so wrong? Her fingers hovered over the stack of case files on her desk. She had ordered a thorough investigation into Musk's background, but it was clear now that there was more to him than she'd ever imagined. There had to be. Musk wasn't the kind of person who was easily caught up in a simple regulatory breach. The man had always operated on a different level, and now she was tangled in his web, whether she liked it or not. But how had this happened? Sarah's legal career had always been defined by a commitment to neutrality. She was supposed to be impartial, unemotional. She didn't get involved. She judged based on the facts. That was the way it worked, wasn't it? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was her assistant, a young woman named Rachel, who had been working for Sarah for almost 3 years now. "Judge Turner," Rachel said, stepping into the room, her face slightly flushed. "There's someone here to see you. A man named David Reynolds. He claims to have information regarding Elon Musk's case." Sarah raised an eyebrow. Reynolds? She had never heard of him. What kind of information? "He didn't say, but he seems urgent. He insists it's something you need to hear in person." Sarah was about to refuse when a strange feeling settled in her stomach. Something about this situation, about the sudden appearance of Reynolds, felt like a sign. Maybe this was what she had been waiting for, the piece of the puzzle that would make everything clear. Or maybe it was just another distraction. "Send him in," she said, her voice calm, but with a sense of purpose she hadn't realized she possessed. Moments later, a man in his early 40s entered the room. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair that looked slightly unkempt, and a suit that seemed to have been chosen more for comfort than style. There was something in his eyes, an intensity that made Sarah sit up straighter. "Judge Turner," he said, his voice low but firm. "My name is David Reynolds. I have information about Elon Musk's case. Information that could change everything." Sarah studied him, measuring his every word. "What kind of information?" Reynolds stepped forward, placing a folder on her desk. "I've been following Musk for years. I know what he's really up to, and I know the truth about why he's in your courtroom today." Sarah's mind raced. "And why should I trust you?" she asked, her tone sharp. "Because, Judge," Reynolds said, locking eyes with her, "Musk is playing a far bigger game than you realize, and you're already in it." The weight of his words hung in the air. Sarah took the folder, her hands suddenly feeling heavy. As she opened it, her eyes scanned the first page, and her pulse quickened. It was a dossier, a thick one, filled with documents, photographs, and confidential memos. But what struck her the most was the name at the top of one of the memos, Elon Musk, and right beneath it, the words Federal Prosecutor. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had known something was off, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. She closed the folder and looked up at Reynolds. "You need to tell me everything," she said, her voice suddenly firm. Reynolds nodded, his expression grim. "Elon Musk is no ordinary billionaire. He's been operating undercover for years, working with federal agencies to expose the corruption within some of the world's largest corporations. But someone powerful doesn't want that information to get out. And now, they're using you, Judge Turner, to stop him." The weight of his words landed on her shoulders like a boulder. She had just made a ruling in the life of a man who was far more than just a tech mogul. She had just unknowingly crossed a line into a world of politics, power, and corruption that she could never have imagined. The game had changed. Elon Musk had always been something of an enigma. To the world, he was a genius, a maverick, a disruptor. But behind the headlines and the billion-dollar companies, there was a man whose ambition was far more complex than anyone had realized. Growing up in Pretoria, South Africa, Elon Musk had always been an outlier. His father, Elon Musk, was a controversial figure, a man who had worked as an electromechanical engineer and had a strained relationship with his son. His mother, May, was a model and dietitian, who instilled in Elon a sense of independence and a curiosity about the world. From a young age, Musk was captivated by science fiction, computers, and the potential to change the world. By the age of 12, he had taught himself computer programming and sold his first video game, a creation called Blaster, for about $500. It wasn't much, but it was the spark that would ignite his insatiable drive. When Elon moved to Canada to attend Queen's University, and later to the University of Pennsylvania, he was already thinking beyond the ordinary. His focus wasn't just on making money. It was about reshaping the very fabric of human existence. His early ventures, Zip2 and X.com, were just the beginning. Zip2 helped newspapers go online, while X.com eventually morphed into PayPal, the payment processing giant that would sell to eBay for $1.5 billion in stock. But that wasn't enough for Musk. His vision stretched into the stars, into clean energy, into artificial intelligence. He founded SpaceX, Tesla, SolarCity, and Neuralink, each company an attempt to bring his ambitious ideas to life and change the world on a scale that few could even comprehend. But for all his success, Musk had always faced opposition, criticism from those who believed his ideas were too far-fetched, too bold, too unrealistic. Tesla was nearly bankrupt multiple times. SpaceX had numerous failed rocket launches. Critics called him arrogant, reckless, even delusional. Yet, Musk had always pushed forward, undeterred by the voices of doubt. But there was more to Musk than just the visionary entrepreneur. Beneath the layers of headlines, innovations, and controversies, there was a quiet, more calculating side to him, one that very few saw. It was the side that had kept him from being just another Silicon Valley millionaire. The side that had allowed him to operate in the shadows, moving in ways that others didn't understand. Musk had always been fascinated by power, how it was wielded, how it could be controlled, and how it could be used to affect the greater good. But what most people didn't know was that he had long been involved in covert work with the federal government. His business dealings had always been about more than just money. They had been about access to information, to resources, to people who could help him bring his grand vision into reality. In a way, Musk had become a part of something much bigger than his companies, or even his own personal goals. He had been working as an undercover federal prosecutor for years, investigating corruption within the highest levels of government and corporate America. It was a role that few knew about, one that he had kept secret to protect both his identity and the safety of his mission. But now, everything was starting to unravel. The fine imposed by Judge Sarah Turner had been part of a calculated plan. Musk had known that the legal system would come into play sooner or later. The violation, an environmental issue at one of his Tesla factories, wasn't as innocent as it seemed. It was a trap set by those who wanted to silence him, a way to discredit him, to take down both his companies and his undercover operation. The accusations against Musk were serious. Environmental violations were a major issue in the public eye, and the last thing he needed was to appear as though he were not practicing what he preached. Musk had always been vocal about climate change, about the future of humanity, about making the world a better place. The irony was not lost on him that the very thing he had fought for could be used to tear him down. But Musk had learned long ago that in order to survive in the world he lived in, he had to think several steps ahead. And this was no different. The fine wasn't a setback, it was just a piece in the larger game. The real battle was about something far greater than corporate regulations or public relations. The real fight was for control of the truth. For Musk, truth had always been a weapon. His entire career had been built on the idea of disrupting established industries with cutting-edge technology and ideas. But now, he was fighting to expose something far more dangerous: the systemic corruption that ran through the very veins of the government and the corporations that controlled so much of the world's wealth. He knew that Sarah Turner's ruling was a blow to his operation. A federal judge had just handed down a fine, not knowing she was dealing with someone who was already playing a far more intricate game. But it was too late to back out now. His involvement in the federal investigation had already put him at risk. The real question was not whether the fine would be overturned, but how much further he could push before the forces against him moved in for the kill. And Sarah Turner, the woman who had just handed down the decision, was now at the center of this high-stakes game. He had been watching her closely, studying her every move in the courtroom. There was something about her that intrigued him. She was sharp, principled, but also vulnerable. He could sense the conflict inside her. Musk wasn't one to trust easily, but something told him that she was someone who could be an ally, or at the very least, someone who might help him take down the true villains in this story. As Musk sat in his office at SpaceX's headquarters in Hawthorne, California, he looked out over the horizon, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. He had worked tirelessly to build everything he had, from electric cars to reusable rockets to brain-computer interfaces. But this battle, the one he was about to face with Judge Turner, was unlike anything he had encountered before. It wasn't just about the law. It was about something deeper. It was about truth, power, and how far people were willing to go to protect their interests. Musk had always known that change required sacrifice. But now, he was about to find out just how high that price would be. Sarah Turner sat in the quiet of her office, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the walls. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The dossier that David Reynolds had handed her weighed heavily on her desk. It had taken every ounce of her self-control not to devour every page in one sitting. The shocking details inside it about Elon Musk's dual identity, the billionaire tech mogul and a covert federal prosecutor, were hard to process. It was a revelation that made the entire case feel like a chess match, with pieces she hadn't known existed until now. Reynolds had been cryptic, only hinting at the bigger picture, the game Musk was playing. The more Sarah thought about it, the more she realized she had been a pawn in something far more complicated than a simple environmental violation. The court case had been set up as a distraction, a way to draw her into something much larger and potentially much more dangerous. As much as Sarah tried to remain impartial, her instinct as a judge and her sense of justice now clashed. She had always prided herself on fairness, on making decisions based on evidence and not letting personal feelings cloud her judgment. But this case was becoming personal, and she wasn't sure she could maintain the distance she had always kept. She couldn't help but wonder, what exactly was Elon Musk doing? And why had he chosen this particular moment, this particular case, to reveal himself, or at least part of himself, in such a high-profile way? Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. An unknown number. "Judge Turner," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sarah," came the smooth, familiar voice on the other end. Her pulse quickened just hearing it. It was David Reynolds. "You've been thinking about what I said," he continued, his tone almost reassuring. "But I need to make something clear." "I'm listening," Sarah said, her voice calm but tight with curiosity. "You're not in this alone. Musk isn't the only one playing this game. There are others, powerful people, who don't want the truth to come out. The violation at the Tesla factory, the fine, it's all part of a much larger web. You're standing in the middle of it now, and whether you like it or not, you've already been involved." Her chest tightened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the fine wasn't an accident. It was a calculated move, part of a bigger strategy. Musk's enemies knew he'd try to fight it. They knew he'd fight back with everything he had. And now they're using you as a pawn in a larger game. But you can still choose your next move." Sarah gripped the edge of her desk, trying to keep her mind from racing. "What do you want from me, David?" "I want you to understand what's at stake here. You've already made your ruling. But now you need to see the bigger picture. If Musk is right, and I believe he is, there's a much deeper conspiracy at play. One that stretches far beyond environmental regulations. It goes all the way to the top." Sarah's head spun. She had heard rumors of corruption, of powerful figures manipulating systems for their own gain. But the sheer scale of what Reynolds was suggesting was almost too much to believe. "You expect me to just take this at face value? To risk my entire career on something as unbelievable as this?" she asked, incredulity creeping into her voice. "I'm not asking you to make a decision right now," Reynolds replied, his voice steady. "But I am asking you to dig deeper. Look beyond the surface. Don't let the public narrative control what you believe. I'll send you more information, documents, files. But you need to be careful, Sarah. There are people who don't want you to find out the truth." The line went silent for a moment, and Sarah felt the weight of his words settle deep into her bones. "I'll be in touch," Reynolds added before the line clicked dead. She sat in the stillness of the room, her fingers tapping absently on the desk. The files, the phone call, the strange feeling of being manipulated. It was all too much. Elon Musk, a federal prosecutor? A man who had been leading a double life for years, operating in the shadows, holding secrets that could tear apart the very fabric of the world she thought she knew. But it wasn't just Musk who concerned her now. It was the people behind the scenes, the ones pulling the strings. Who were they? What did they stand to gain from destroying Musk? And why had they chosen her to be part of their plan? Her mind raced with questions, but deep down, she knew the only way to get answers was to keep digging. And that meant continuing with the case, despite how uncomfortable it made her, despite the danger that might lie ahead. The next morning, the courtroom was buzzing with activity. The trial was scheduled to continue, with the defense expected to call their first witnesses. But Sarah wasn't focused on the proceedings. Her mind kept drifting back to Musk, to the accusations against him, and the unsettling knowledge that this case was part of something far bigger. She arrived early, as was her usual routine, and took a seat in the quiet courtroom. The defense team was already huddled at their table, whispering in low voices, preparing their strategy. Elon Musk sat near the back, flanked by his lawyers, a picture of calm detachment. Sarah watched him, her gaze narrowing. What was he really up to? And how far was he willing to go to protect the truth, or to destroy those who stood in his way? As the proceedings began, she forced herself to focus. She couldn't afford distractions. Not now. The defense team called their first witness, a former employee from one of Tesla's factories who testified about the circumstances surrounding the alleged violation. The witness spoke with confidence, laying out the details of the situation and reinforcing the idea that it had been a simple mistake, one that Musk's company had already taken steps to address. But Sarah wasn't listening to the details of the testimony. She was watching Musk, whose face remained as unreadable as ever. She could see the wheels turning in his mind, his posture relaxed, yet somehow, there was an intensity in his eyes that made her uneasy. Every now and then, he would glance toward the bench, his gaze lingering just long enough to make Sarah feel as though he were aware of her every thought. It was as if he were waiting for her to make a move, waiting for her to step deeper into his game. She cleared her throat and refocused on the witness. It was too soon to make any decisions, but the feeling gnawing at her stomach told her one thing. This wasn't just another case. This was war. The courtroom was a stage, and Sarah Turner felt herself playing the role of an unwilling actor, thrust into a performance she had no script for. Every piece of the puzzle she was trying to solve was slipping further out of her grasp, as though the more she uncovered, the more tangled the situation became. She watched as the defense continued with their presentation, each witness painting a picture of innocence, of corporate mistakes, of things that could be explained away. But none of it felt right. There were gaps in their story, contradictions that didn't add up. And Elon Musk, with his unreadable expression, seemed to be at the center of it all, standing apart from the noise around him like a man who knew the final outcome before the first card was dealt. Sarah's eyes flickered back to Musk as the defense called their next witness, a high-ranking executive from Tesla who spoke about the company's commitment to environmental responsibility. The executive laid out the steps Tesla had taken to fix the alleged violation, painting Musk as a man who always prioritized ethics. It was a perfect defense, crafted meticulously to protect Musk's public image, but something about it felt rehearsed, too polished. Sarah tapped her fingers on the side of her gavel, her mind working through the evidence, through the layers of the case. She had already started to question whether this was truly about environmental regulation at all. Everything was leading her to believe that the issue went far deeper than that, and her conversation with David Reynolds hadn't done anything to ease her doubts. She found herself remembering their last conversation. Reynolds' words echoed in her mind. "You're already in the game, Sarah." She didn't want to admit it, but he was right. She was in it now, whether she wanted to be or not. And with every decision she made, the stakes grew higher. Musk hadn't flinched during the testimonies, remaining stoic and composed. But Sarah had a feeling that the calm was just a facade. There was something beneath the surface, something far more dangerous. Her gut told her that the story she was hearing in the courtroom wasn't the whole story. The moment the session adjourned for lunch, Sarah stood up from her bench and walked down the hallway to her chambers. Her assistant, Rachel, was waiting outside the door, her expression tense. "Judge Turner," Rachel said, hesitating before continuing, "there's someone here to see you. A man named Thomas Lee. He says it's urgent." "Thomas Lee?" Sarah asked, furrowing her brow. The name wasn't familiar. "Yes. He says he has information about Elon Musk's case," Rachel added. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Not again. She didn't need another mysterious person with information, especially after the last encounter with Reynolds. But there was something in Rachel's voice, a nervous edge, that made Sarah reconsider. Maybe this was the lead she needed to make sense of everything. "Send him in," Sarah said, her voice firm. Moments later, a man in his late 30s entered her chambers. He was well-dressed in a dark suit, his face sharp and calculating. There was a nervousness in his eyes, but also a certain urgency that told Sarah this wasn't a social call. "Judge Turner," he said, his voice clipped. "Thank you for meeting with me." "Who are you?" Sarah asked, folding her arms across her chest. "And what do you want?" "My name is Thomas Lee," he said, glancing at the door as though to make sure no one was listening. "I'm an investigator working with a group of people who've been tracking Musk for some time. I have information, real information, that will shed light on what he's really been doing. But it's not something I can say openly. Not in a public setting." Sarah's mind raced. She had already heard similar claims, but there was something about his tone, the way he was speaking, that made her listen more intently. "Go on," Sarah said, motioning for him to continue. Lee stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Musk is involved in far more than just a corporate cover-up. He's a key player in a larger federal investigation, one that spans across industries and even government entities. He's been operating as an undercover agent for years, working with the Department of Justice to expose corruption at the highest levels of government. What you're hearing in court is just the tip of the iceberg. And what you don't know, what no one knows, is that the fine you imposed was a trap. It wasn't just about Tesla's environmental violations. It's about stopping Musk from exposing what he's uncovered." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The words federal investigation echoed in her mind, and a knot tightened in her stomach. She had suspected something larger was at play, but hearing it confirmed like this made the situation even more real and more dangerous. "You're telling me Musk is working as a federal agent?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lee nodded. "Yes. He's been working with federal prosecutors for years. His companies, Tesla, SpaceX, are just a front. He's been collecting evidence, infiltrating the very systems of power that control this country. But now, those powers are trying to stop him, and they've used you to do it." Sarah felt the weight of his words settle heavily in her chest. She couldn't process everything at once, but one thing was clear. She was caught in the crossfire of a war that she hadn't asked to be a part of. "If what you're saying is true, then Musk is in danger," Sarah said, her thoughts racing. "And so am I." Lee hesitated before speaking again. "Yes, you're involved because of the role you're playing in his public trial. People are watching you, Sarah. If you don't help Musk now, the consequences won't just affect him. They'll affect you, too. There are forces far more powerful than you can imagine, and they will stop at nothing to protect their interests." Sarah's mind flashed back to her earlier conversation with Reynolds. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the bigger picture was still too unclear. Musk has powerful enemies, and right now, it seems like they're winning, Sarah said, her voice barely audible. Lee nodded. "You're his only hope. He trusts you. He needs you to uncover the truth before it's too late. If you don't act now, everything he's worked for will be destroyed, and so will you." The gravity of the situation hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. She felt herself sinking into the realization that her role in this case had shifted. She wasn't just the judge anymore. She was a participant in a much bigger game. A game where the stakes were higher than anything she had ever imagined. As the door closed behind Lee, Sarah stood in the center of her office, trying to absorb everything. The room seemed smaller now, more oppressive. For the first time in her career, Sarah knew that her next decision wouldn't just affect the case before her. It would change everything. And she had no idea if she was ready. The next few days felt like a blur to Sarah Turner. Every time she tried to focus on her work, her mind would veer back to the conversation with Thomas Lee. The weight of his words, the shock of discovering that Elon Musk was not only a billionaire entrepreneur, but also a covert federal agent, hung over her like a cloud that refused to dissipate. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was caught in something much bigger than herself, something she had no control over. But she had always prided herself on her ability to make decisions under pressure. Now, though, every choice felt like a delicate balancing act. Musk wasn't just a defendant in her courtroom anymore. He was a man operating in the shadows, and she didn't know whether he was playing her or if he was genuinely someone trying to take down a corrupt system. And Lee's warning, "You're in the game now," kept echoing in her mind. She had to decide where her allegiance lay, but that was easier said than done. How could she trust Musk, a man whose empire had been built on secrecy and technological dominance? How could she trust Lee, an investigator who had shown up out of nowhere with promises of hidden truths and grand conspiracies? But as much as she hated to admit it, Sarah knew she had no choice but to dig deeper. The case, the fine, the accusation of environmental violations, it all seemed like part of a much larger narrative. And if she wanted to understand the full scope of it, she would have to enter the labyrinth of power and secrets where few had dared to go. That night, after hours, Sarah found herself sitting in her dimly lit office, her fingers tapping absently on the desk. The courthouse was quiet, the usual bustle of lawyers, jurors, and assistants a distant memory. She wasn't alone. A knock on her door broke the silence, and before she could speak, the door creaked open. David Reynolds stepped inside, his tall frame blocking most of the light from the hallway. He had a knowing look in his eyes, as though he had been expecting her. "Judge Turner," he said, his voice steady, but there was a hint of something else. Urgency, perhaps. "We need to talk." Sarah motioned for him to take a seat. "About Musk?" she asked, already dreading the answer. Reynolds nodded, sitting across from her. "Yes, about Musk and everything that's been happening behind the scenes. It's time you know exactly what's at stake here." Sarah leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "I've already heard enough. I spoke to Thomas Lee. He gave me a pretty detailed account of Musk's other work. But I still don't know if I can trust either of you." Reynolds' expression didn't change. He simply looked at her with the same calm, collected demeanor he always had. But there was a flicker of something. Concern? "You're right to be cautious. You're in the middle of something bigger than you realize. Musk's role in the investigation is just the surface. There are people involved who have more power than you can imagine, people who will do anything to protect their interests. And right now, they see you as a threat." "A threat?" Sarah repeated, leaning forward slightly. "I'm just doing my job." "That's exactly why you're a threat," Reynolds said. "Because you're not like the others. You actually care about justice. And that's something they can't control." Sarah sat in silence, processing his words. She had always prided herself on being impartial, on upholding the law without bias. But now, it felt like the rules had changed. The system she had trusted was crumbling, and she was caught in the middle of a battle that wasn't just about corporate malfeasance or environmental law. It was about power, secrets, and control. "I need to know what I'm dealing with here," Sarah said finally, her voice steady. "What is it that Musk has uncovered? Why is he being targeted?" Reynolds hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the door. "I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you this. What Musk has uncovered goes far beyond corporate fraud. He's been investigating a network of high-ranking government officials and business leaders who've been manipulating policies, siphoning public funds, and using their positions for personal gain. These people have no intention of letting Musk expose them. And that's why he's being attacked, because he's too dangerous to their empire." Sarah processed his words carefully. A network of high-ranking officials and business leaders manipulating the system for personal gain? It sounded like something out of a political thriller, but Reynolds' expression was serious. She could see the weight of what he was saying. "But why involve me? Why make me part of this?" she asked, feeling the tension build in her chest. "Because you're already in the game, Sarah," Reynolds said. "Your ruling on Musk's case is more important than you realize. It's not just about a fine. It's about controlling the narrative. If Musk wins, it gives him credibility, and that's the last thing they want. They need you to be on the other side. But you don't have to be." Sarah felt the weight of his words settle heavily in her mind. They need me to be on the other side. It made sense. Her role in the case was pivotal, and if she ruled against Musk, it would be a victory for those who wanted to bury the truth. But what if she could turn the tide? "What do you suggest I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Reynolds leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I'm not asking you to make a decision yet, but you need to start thinking about the bigger picture. Think about the kind of world you want to live in. If you side with him, if you allow this corruption to continue, you're not just giving Musk a punishment, you're enabling something far worse. But if you help him, if you uncover the truth, you can be part of something much larger than yourself. You can be part of a revolution. Sarah's mind raced. A revolution? It sounded so grand, so impossible. But in that moment, she realized the truth. She wasn't just a judge. She was now a player in a game that would shape the future, whether she liked it or not. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. How do I uncover the truth? Reynolds stood up, his face a mask of determination. You'll need to dig deeper into the evidence, Sarah. Don't rely on what you're being told. Look at the connections. Follow the money. Follow the people. But where do I start? She asked, standing up as well. Start with Musk, Reynolds said, his voice low and firm. The truth is there, hidden beneath everything he's built. He's playing a dangerous game, but he's also the key to bringing everything down. You just have to decide which side you're on. As Reynolds walked toward the door, Sarah's heart raced. She was standing at a crossroads, and the path she chose now would define everything. She had been warned, but there was no turning back. She glanced down at the papers on her desk, the case file for Musk staring back at her. The decision was hers, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't know what was right. The decision weighed on Sarah Turner as she returned to her chambers late into the night. The walls of her office felt suffocating, as if they were closing in on her. It wasn't just the case anymore. It was everything. The shadowy network of powerful figures, the secret dealings, the mystery surrounding Elon Musk, and now, the unsettling truth about the lengths people would go to in order to protect their own interests. It was overwhelming. And yet, the more she thought about it, the more she knew that the path ahead would define not just her career, but her very sense of justice. She hadn't signed up for this. She was just a judge, trying to uphold the law. But now, the law seemed to be only one part of a much larger story, one in which she was now an unwilling participant. The stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. Her phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was an unknown number. The same kind of number that had been reaching out to her recently, each call bringing more pieces to a puzzle she had no choice but to solve. Judge Turner, she answered, trying to steady her voice. Sarah, came a familiar voice, David Reynolds again. His tone was clipped, more urgent than usual. We need to talk. It's time to make a move. Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. The moment she had been dreading had arrived. She was standing at the edge, and there was no easy way down. What move? She asked, though she already had a feeling of what he would say. You've been given enough information to make a choice, Reynolds continued. And that choice needs to be made now. The people after Musk aren't just waiting. They're moving. If you don't act fast, you could lose him. We could lose everything. Sarah ran a hand through her hair, trying to absorb the weight of his words. What do you want me to do? I've arranged a meeting with Musk, Reynolds said, his voice growing more intense. He's ready to talk. He wants to tell you the truth, his side of the story. But you have to be there, Sarah. You can't wait any longer. Her pulse quickened. Meeting Musk? In person? The man who had carefully crafted his public image as a tech genius and visionary was suddenly something more. An enigma, a man whose motives were as unclear as his hidden life. She had already made a ruling against him, but what if she had been wrong? What if there was more to his story than she could see? I don't know if I can trust him, Sarah said, her voice tight with doubt. I'm not asking you to trust him, Reynolds replied sharply. I'm asking you to listen. You need to hear him out. The clock's ticking, and I'm not sure how much time he has left. The people after him, they don't care about justice. They care about power. And they'll do anything to keep Musk from exposing them. Sarah bit her lip, torn between the desire to maintain control over the situation and the undeniable feeling that this was a turning point she couldn't ignore. Her gut told her that the moment she stepped into that meeting, things would never be the same. But how could she not take that step? If Musk was truly playing a larger game, if he had information that could expose the corruption of those in power, could she really sit back and do nothing? Where and when? She asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. I'll send the details. Be ready, Reynolds said before the line went dead. The following morning, Sarah woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly. As she grabbed it, she found a series of encrypted messages waiting for her. They contained the details of the meeting with Elon Musk. The location was a private, undisclosed venue, one of Musk's properties hidden away from the public eye. Reynolds had warned her not to trust anyone else, that there would be no witnesses to this conversation, and that secrecy was paramount. As she prepared for the meeting, Sarah's mind kept racing. If she was going to hear Musk's side of the story, she needed to approach this with a level head. She couldn't afford to get emotionally involved, not yet. Anyway, she needed clarity. But even as she told herself that, a nagging voice in the back of her mind kept asking, "What if you're being played?" It wasn't long before Sarah found herself standing at the gates of Musk's private estate, the property stretching for miles around her. The security was tight, guards at every corner, surveillance cameras hidden among the trees. It was clear that this wasn't just any ordinary home. This was a fortress, built to keep unwanted eyes at bay. The meeting was to take place in a secluded room within the estate, a place where Musk conducted his most private affairs. As Sarah was escorted through the hallways, her footsteps echoed on the polished floors. The atmosphere was tense, charged with an energy that seemed to vibrate in the air. The door to the room opened, and Sarah found herself face to face with Elon Musk for the first time since the trial began. He stood tall, his posture commanding yet relaxed, his gaze steady as he watched her enter. Despite everything she had heard about him, it was impossible not to be struck by his presence. There was something magnetic about him, something that hinted at the immense power he wielded behind closed doors. "Judge Turner," Musk greeted her, his voice calm but intense. "I've been waiting for this moment." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a step into the room, scanning her surroundings. There was a feeling of isolation here, as if this was a world far removed from the one she knew. Musk had built this space for himself, a place where no one could reach him, not even the law. "Let's get to it," Sarah said finally, her tone professional, though her nerves were on edge. "I'm here to hear your side of things. What is it that you want me to understand?" Musk moved to the desk, where several documents were laid out in front of him. He didn't offer her a seat, but instead gestured for her to stand. "I'm sure you've heard plenty of stories about me," he said, his voice soft yet purposeful, "but none of them tell you the whole truth. I've been playing a game for a long time, Judge Turner, and it's not a game anyone can afford to lose." Sarah crossed her arms, maintaining a composed stance. "You've certainly made that clear in your actions. But what game, Musk? What exactly is it you're trying to achieve?" He met her gaze with a mixture of defiance and conviction. "I'm not just trying to save myself. I'm trying to save everyone. The system is broken, and I've seen it from the inside. I've watched it happen, piece by piece, how those in power manipulate everything. Laws, resources, the very people they're supposed to protect. This trial isn't about an environmental fine. It's about silencing me before I can expose them. But I'm not backing down." Sarah was silent for a long moment, taking in what Musk had said. The man before her wasn't just a businessman. He was a whistleblower, a man with a mission to bring down an entire system of corruption. But was he telling the truth? Was he truly the hero of this story, or was he just another player in a much bigger game? "You want me to help you," Sarah said carefully, her mind trying to process the implications of his words. "I want you to understand why it's important that you don't fall for their lies," Musk replied. "You're already in too deep, Judge. You've made a decision that could destroy everything I've worked for. But it doesn't have to be this way. You can change the course of this story." Sarah's heart raced. She had thought she was in control, but now she saw how much she had yet to understand. She had to make a choice, and the consequences of that choice would reverberate far beyond this courtroom. "Why should I trust you?" Sarah asked, her voice steady but filled with doubt. Musk's eyes hardened, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flash of something beyond the calm facade, a flicker of desperation. "Because if you don't, we both lose. And so does everyone else." The room seemed to close in on Sarah as Elon Musk's words echoed in her mind. "If you don't, we both lose. And so does everyone else." The weight of his statement pressed down on her, heavy with implication. Could this really be true? Could everything she knew about the system be wrong? Musk had made a powerful case, but Sarah wasn't one to jump to conclusions, no matter how compelling the argument. She needed evidence. She needed to see the truth for herself. For a long moment, the silence between them stretched, neither of them speaking. Musk stood across from her, his posture still confident, but there was an intensity in his eyes that betrayed the gravity of what was at stake. It was as if he, too, was waiting for her to make up her mind, to make the right choice. "I'm not here to make decisions for you, Judge," Musk said, breaking the silence. "I'm here to show you the truth. What you do with it is up to you." Sarah could feel the pulse of tension in the air. She was on the edge of something monumental, a tipping point that could change the course of her life. But she didn't know which direction to go. "You're asking me to trust you," Sarah said, her voice calm, though her mind was swirling. "But trust has to be earned, Mr. Musk. You haven't given me any reason to trust you yet." Musk nodded, as if expecting this response. "Fair enough," he said, his tone unflinching. "But let me show you something that might change your perspective." With that, he motioned to one of his assistants standing just outside the door. The assistant entered with a folder in hand and placed it gently on the table in front of Sarah. She stared at it for a moment, unsure of what to expect. But she knew that whatever was inside, it was the key to understanding the depths of the situation she found herself in. Musk opened the folder and pushed it toward her, his gaze never leaving her face. "These are the documents that prove everything I've been telling you. They show the connections, the cover-ups, the manipulation of power. All of it." Reluctantly, Sarah opened the folder and began to sift through the papers inside. Her eyes widened as she scanned the first few pages. There were financial statements, emails, legal documents, all pointing to the same thing. A vast network of influential figures, government officials, high-profile business leaders, working in tandem to exploit their positions for personal gain. This wasn't just about a few bad apples in the system. This was a coordinated effort to control the very institutions that were supposed to serve the public. The deeper she dug into the folder, the more she realized how far-reaching this conspiracy went. She found evidence of bribes, illegal lobbying, and questionable financial transactions, all tied back to several powerful names she recognized. Names she had once trusted. Names that held sway over much of the government and the corporate world. But there was something else buried in the details. Something that made Sarah pause. These documents weren't just about exposing corruption. They were about exposing a systematic, deliberate effort to silence anyone who tried to challenge the status quo. And that included Elon Musk. Sarah closed the folder slowly, her mind racing. If this is true, then everything I thought I knew about the world was a lie. But how could it be true? Why would Musk have this evidence, and why would he show it to me? Musk watched her closely, sensing the shift in her demeanor. "I know it's hard to believe," he said quietly, "but sometimes the truth is more complicated than we want it to be." Sarah didn't speak for a moment. The room was thick with uncertainty. Her instincts told her that Musk was playing some kind of game. He was a master manipulator, after all, but the documents in front of her were undeniable. They were too detailed, too intricate, to be fabricated. She had seen enough in her years on the bench to recognize when something was real, and this felt real. "I don't know if I can act on this," she said softly, the uncertainty in her voice betraying her usually composed exterior. "If I expose this, if I bring this to light, I'm not just taking down Musk or the people you've named here. I'll be dismantling the entire system." Musk's expression remained neutral, though his eyes held a glimmer of understanding. "That's exactly why I'm telling you, Judge. You're not just deciding my fate. You're deciding the fate of everyone who's been hurt by this system. You're deciding whether or not we can ever hope for real change." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Sarah had always believed in justice. She had always believed that the law, in its purest form, could correct wrongs and bring about change. But now, standing here with the weight of this evidence in front of her, she wondered if the law had ever really been the solution, or if it had always been a tool to preserve the power of the few. "I can't do this alone," Sarah said, more to herself than to Musk. "I can't make this kind of decision without knowing who else is involved, without knowing what I'm really up against." I'm not asking you to do this alone, Musk replied, his voice steady. I'm asking you to be the first to step forward, to be the first to make a stand. If you take this information, you won't just be doing it for me. You'll be doing it for everyone who's been silenced, for every person whose voice has been drowned out by the people in power. There it was again, the call to action, the weight of the responsibility, the promise of change, and the risk of everything she knew coming crashing down. But was it worth it? Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing across the room, trying to think clearly. What if he's right? What if this is my only chance to make a real difference? She turned back to face Musk, her mind made up. I can't promise anything, she said, her voice firm, but I'll help you. I'll investigate this. I'll see where it leads. Musk gave a small nod, his face softening slightly. That's all I'm asking. The truth isn't easy to uncover, but it's worth the fight. I'm going to need time, Sarah said, her voice steady as she felt the weight of what she had just committed to. I'll give you as much time as you need, Musk replied. But be careful, Judge. You've already made enemies, and they won't hesitate to stop you. As Sarah turned to leave the room, a mixture of determination and fear settled in her chest. She had just taken the first step toward uncovering the truth, but in doing so, she had also taken the first step into a world of danger. The question was no longer whether she could uncover the truth. It was whether she could survive long enough to expose it. Sarah spent the next few days in a haze of work and doubt. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the edge of something much bigger than she had ever anticipated. Each document Musk had shown her seemed to confirm her worst fears about the system: corruption, manipulation, the careful web of influence that kept everything in check, all designed to maintain the status quo. But the more she looked into it, the more she began to realize just how deep this web went. It wasn't just government officials and powerful businessmen. It was everyone. The whole system was rigged. She'd always believed in the idea that the law could stand against corruption. But now, the more she dug into these documents, the more she saw how easily the law could be twisted and bent to serve the people at the top. In all her years as a judge, she had never seen anything like this. Not in the cases she'd handled, nor in any of the high-profile trials she'd been part of. This was different. This was a dangerous game, one where the rules were made up as they went along. She couldn't go to the authorities. She couldn't trust them. The very people who were supposed to uphold the law were the ones who were in on it. The more she thought about it, the more she realized she was on her own. If she was going to make a difference, she had to rely on herself. Late one evening, as Sarah sat alone in her office, her mind racing with the endless connections between the names and figures that filled the documents, her phone rang again. The number was unknown, but she knew exactly who it was before she even answered. Judge Turner, the voice on the other end said. It was David Reynolds again. I've been thinking about everything you've told me, she said, her voice tight, and I'm starting to wonder if I've made a mistake. Don't start second-guessing yourself now, Reynolds replied, his tone sharp but reassuring. You're already too deep in. There's no turning back. I never wanted to be this deep in, Sarah admitted, her fingers tapping nervously on her desk. I thought I could just do my job, keep things above board, and move on. But now it feels like I'm being dragged into something I can't control. Reynolds' laugh was bitter. None of us ever really have control, do we? Not when you're up against the kind of people we're dealing with. Musk's in the crosshairs, but so are you now. If you think you can walk away from this without consequences, you're wrong. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The enormity of the situation hit her all over again. What do you want from me? I want you to follow through, Reynolds said, his voice now more urgent. You're on the inside now. You know things that could change the game. But you can't back down. If you do, it'll all come crashing down. They won't stop until they silence you. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. What do you mean by silence me? The people we're dealing with, they're dangerous, Reynolds warned. They have power. They have resources. They will do anything to protect themselves, and they'll destroy anyone in their way. That includes you. I don't know if I can handle this, Sarah whispered, the weight of his words sinking in. She had already been in tough situations, but this was different. This wasn't just about the law, it was about survival. You don't have a choice, Reynolds shot back. Either you stand up and fight, or you'll be just another victim. The longer you wait, the harder it gets. The clock's ticking. The line went silent for a moment. Sarah didn't know what to say. Everything about this situation felt wrong, but she was already too far gone. Reynolds was right. She had no choice but to see this through. Fine, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. I'll do it, but I need more information. I need to know exactly who I'm up against. I can give you names, but you need to be careful, Reynolds cautioned. You don't know who's with you and who's against you. It's all part of the game, and there's no way out once you're in. Over the next few days, Sarah continued her investigation. She spent hours in the courthouse library, poring over case files, old trial transcripts, and public records. Every time she thought she had a lead, it turned out to be a dead end, or worse, a trap. She could feel the pressure building. The walls were closing in, and every step she took seemed to bring her closer to an unknown danger. But then, something clicked. One of the names she had uncovered in the documents Musk had given her kept showing up over and over again, in places she hadn't expected. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, but as Sarah dug deeper, it became clear that this person was at the center of it all. They were connected to everyone, the politicians, the businessmen, even some of the judges she had once worked alongside. This person was pulling the strings from behind the scenes, manipulating everything and everyone. Sarah's heart raced as she realized the full extent of the conspiracy she was up against. This was bigger than she had imagined. The person she had been chasing in her investigation wasn't just a criminal. They were the mastermind behind everything. And if she was going to bring the system down, she would have to go after them. But there was a problem. This person was untouchable. They had connections everywhere, from the highest levels of government to the most influential corporations. If Sarah made a move, they would know. And once they knew she was onto them, there would be no turning back. She couldn't do this alone. Sarah reached for her phone and made a call to Reynolds. When he answered, she didn't hesitate. I need help. I'm not getting anywhere with this. I need resources. I need people who can help me go after the ones who are really pulling the strings. Reynolds was quiet for a moment. You sure you're ready for this? I don't have a choice anymore, she said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping in. I've already seen too much, and I'm not going to let them win. All right, Reynolds said, his voice finally softening. I'll get you what you need, but you have to be careful. You're not just fighting a case anymore. You're fighting an empire. As Sarah prepared to go further down this dark path, she realized just how much she had to lose. The person she was after wasn't just a criminal. They were a powerful figure, a person who could destroy her career and her life in an instant. But she couldn't back down. She couldn't let them win. The fight was just beginning. The next few days were a blur of adrenaline and fear. Sarah barely slept, her mind constantly racing through the implications of what she was uncovering. She had made the decision to pursue the truth, but every piece of evidence she found only revealed the staggering size of the operation she was up against. There were so many moving parts, so many people involved in keeping the system hidden and protected, and with every step she took, the danger grew. She had contacted Reynolds again, and true to his word, he had started providing her with resources. He connected her to a small team of trusted allies, investigators, hackers, and former insiders who had also seen too much and were willing to help. They were the only ones who could guide her through the labyrinth of corruption that now seemed to stretch endlessly before her. Sarah's office had become a war room. Files were strewn across her desk, her computer screen filled with encrypted messages and private documents. Every hour, new pieces of the puzzle arrived, and each one told the same story. Someone powerful, someone connected, was pulling all the strings. And as much as she wanted to focus on the legal side of things, on the facts, the rules, the structure, Sarah knew the truth was far from a courtroom drama. It was a game of shadows, and the stakes were far higher than she ever imagined. Late one night, after hours of combing through records, Sarah sat back in her chair, her eyes burning with exhaustion. She had been reviewing financial records when she noticed something, an anomaly, a series of small payments linked to the same entity hidden in dozens of shell corporations. At first, It seemed like a simple case of money laundering, but then she saw the connections. The payments were linked to people she knew, prominent politicians, and judges, and they all had one thing in common. They had been involved in past cases where the outcomes seemed suspicious. Suddenly, everything she had seen in those documents Musk had given her began to click into place. This was no ordinary conspiracy. It was a multi-layered operation that stretched across not just the government, but the very fabric of the legal system. Sarah had long believed in the integrity of the law, but now she was forced to confront the horrifying reality that those in power were using the law itself as a weapon. What had once seemed like isolated corruption was now part of a larger, more dangerous plan. Just as she began to grasp the scale of what was happening, Sarah's phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. Hesitating only for a moment, she answered. Judge Turner. A voice on the other end said, smooth and professional. We need to talk. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. There was something in the voice, cold, calculated, that made her blood run cold. Who is this? She asked, her voice sharp despite the anxiety building in her chest. You've been digging into things you don't fully understand, the voice replied, almost a whisper. And now, you're at a crossroads. You're playing a dangerous game, Judge. A chill settled over her as she listened to the voice. It wasn't someone she recognized, but she knew immediately that this was someone connected to the conspiracy. The power, the control, it was all there in the way they spoke. I don't know who you are, but I know what you're doing, Sarah said, trying to maintain her composure. And I'm not afraid of you. I'm exposing the truth. The voice on the other end chuckled, dark and ominous. You think exposing the truth is going to change anything? You think you're going to take down an empire? You're just one person, Judge. One person in a game that has been played for generations. You're nothing. Sarah clenched her jaw, trying to push through the growing panic. I'm not backing down. I will bring this to light, no matter what. You're not listening, the voice said, its tone colder now. You have no idea what you're up against. We've been operating in the shadows for years, Judge. The ones you think are on your side? They've all been compromised. And as for Musk, well, let's just say he's not the man you think he is. The words hung in the air like a bomb. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Musk wasn't the man she thought he was. She had trusted him. She had believed he was on the side of justice, someone who could help her expose the truth. But now, this mysterious voice was calling into question everything she had been working toward. What do you mean by that? Sarah demanded, her heart pounding in her chest. I can't tell you everything, the voice replied, but I will give you a warning. Stop your investigation. Walk away, or you will regret it. The line went dead. For a long time, Sarah sat there, staring at her phone, her mind reeling. The warning had been clear, but it raised even more questions. Who was this person? And what did they mean when they said Musk wasn't who she thought he was? She had already known that Musk was playing a dangerous game, but was he a part of the conspiracy? Or was he, too, being manipulated? She rubbed her temples, trying to think. She had always prided herself on trusting her instincts, but now, everything felt clouded. The uncertainty, the danger, it was all beginning to overwhelm her. The truth was slipping further and further away, hidden in a web of lies and manipulation. And the more Sarah tried to unravel it, the more she realized she was losing control of the very investigation she had started. The line between friend and enemy was blurring, and every move she made only seemed to push her closer to a cliff she wasn't sure she could avoid. The next morning, as Sarah sat at her desk, reviewing new information, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Reynolds. Her eyes flicked across the screen. Meet me at the usual place. We need to talk. It's urgent. She had no time to waste. As she grabbed her coat and headed out the door, the weight of the situation settled in her chest. She wasn't sure who to trust anymore, but she knew one thing for certain. The walls were closing in fast, and if she didn't act soon, the truth might be buried forever. As Sarah made her way to the meeting spot, a small cafe in a quiet part of town, her mind raced. The message had been urgent, but Reynolds had been cryptic. What did he have to tell her that was so important? And would it help her uncover the truth? Or was she being led further down a path that would lead to her own destruction? The answer lay just ahead, but Sarah wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. Sarah arrived at the cafe, her mind still spinning from the mysterious phone call she had received the night before. She pushed the door open, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled her senses. It was a quiet morning, and the soft hum of hushed conversations and clinking cups did little to ease the tension that knotted in her stomach. She scanned the room, her eyes darting over the scattered patrons, but there was no sign of Reynolds. She chose a table near the window, as usual, and sat down to wait. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out her phone, glancing over the encrypted files and documents she had been reviewing. There were new leads, new names, names she hadn't seen before. She couldn't help but wonder how many more she was yet to uncover. Every new piece of information felt like it was closing in on her, but it also made the picture clearer. This wasn't just a few corrupt individuals. It was a system, a network, a deep-seated machine designed to protect itself at all costs. As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, the door to the cafe opened, and Reynolds entered. He looked more disheveled than usual. His usually sharp suit was wrinkled, his tie askew, his eyes tired. He spotted Sarah immediately and walked over, sitting down across from her without a word. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared acknowledgement that the stakes had never been higher. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but Reynolds held up a hand, silencing her. "Listen," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I don't have much time. We need to get to the point." Sarah leaned in, her heartbeat quickening. "What's going on, Reynolds? You said it was urgent." Reynolds took a deep breath, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "I've been digging into things myself. You've uncovered a lot, more than I expected. But you're missing something." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" "I've been following the money, the connections. It all points to one person." He nodded slowly, but his gaze was distant, as if he was calculating something in his mind. "Yes, you've been looking at the right players. But you're only seeing the surface. You think you're fighting a system of corruption, but you're actually fighting the very people who built it." Sarah's confusion deepened. "I don't understand. Who else is there? Who's pulling the strings if it's not the people I've been looking at?" Reynolds lowered his voice even more. "There's a name I've been trying to keep off your radar. A name you need to be careful with." "Who?" "The name is Lucas Cartwright." The name hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She had heard whispers of Cartwright before. He was a well-known businessman, an influential philanthropist, and one of the most powerful men in the country. But she had never connected him to the conspiracy until now. Everyone knew Cartwright's face. He was a fixture in the media, a man of wealth and apparent integrity. But she had learned long ago that the faces the world saw weren't always the faces of truth. "What do you mean, be careful?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with a mixture of disbelief and growing fear. "Cartwright is the one behind it all," Reynolds replied. "He's the mastermind. He's been pulling the strings for years, controlling everything from the shadows. He's the one who's orchestrating the manipulation of the legal system, the political deals, the corporate takeovers. All of it." Sarah felt her stomach churn. Lucas Cartwright was untouchable. He was the face of corporate responsibility, the man who donated millions to charity, who had his name on schools, hospitals, and even entire neighborhoods. His public image was pristine, a beacon of success and integrity. If he was the one behind the corruption, then everything Sarah thought she knew about the world was a lie. "You're telling me Cartwright is behind all of this," she whispered. "He's the one who's been manipulating the system?" Reynolds nodded grimly. "Yes, and he's got allies everywhere. Politicians, judges, CEOs. You've been chasing the wrong leads. You've been focusing on the puppets, not the puppeteer." Sarah's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, but it was worse than she had imagined. Cartwright was the key to everything. If he was behind it all, then he wasn't just some businessman to be exposed. He was the very heart of the corruption. He was the one who had built this empire of deceit, and he would stop at nothing to protect it. "How do you know all of this?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking with the weight of the revelation. "I've worked with Cartwright before," Reynolds admitted, his voice barely audible. "I was once part of his inner circle." I was a part of the system you're trying to expose. But then, I realized who he really was. I realized the kind of power he had, and I got out. But Cartwright doesn't let people walk away. Ever. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. You're telling me you were a part of this? That you were working for him? Reynolds looked away, unable to meet her eyes. I didn't know what I was a part of at first. I thought it was just business. I thought it was just the way the world worked. But once I saw the full picture, once I saw the corruption, the destruction, it was too late. I tried to leave, but Cartwright has a way of making sure people stay loyal. Or else. Sarah repeated, her voice growing more urgent. What does that mean? Reynolds hesitated, his face pale. It means people disappear, Judge. People who get in Cartwright's way vanish without a trace. If you keep pushing forward with your investigation, Cartwright won't hesitate to deal with you. And I'm not sure anyone can protect you once that happens. The room felt like it was closing in on Sarah. She had known things were dangerous. She had known the risks when she decided to pursue the truth. But this was something else. This wasn't just corruption. This was a man who had the power to destroy anyone who opposed him. I can't back down now, Sarah said, her voice trembling but resolute. I have to expose him. I have to stop him. Reynolds' eyes darkened. Then you need to be prepared. Cartwright won't just fight you with money or influence. He'll fight dirty. He'll do whatever it takes to protect his empire. And you'll be fighting not just against him, but against everything he's built. The system, the law, the people you thought you could trust. Sarah's mind was racing, but she knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back. She had come this far, and now, the fight had escalated to something far more dangerous than she had imagined. If she was going to expose Cartwright, she needed to be smarter, more strategic than ever before. But the stakes had just gone higher, and Sarah knew, with chilling certainty, that the consequences of failure were deadly. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Sarah had never felt so out of her depth. She was used to being in control, to navigating the courtrooms and handling complex cases with precision. But this wasn't a legal battle. It was a war. And she was facing an enemy unlike any she had ever imagined. Lucas Cartwright wasn't just a businessman. He was a kingmaker, a puppet master who had woven his influence into every level of society. And now, it seemed, she had walked right into his crosshairs. As she sat in the quiet cafe with Reynolds, the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. She couldn't back down. Not now. But the enormity of the situation was sinking in. She wasn't just fighting a corrupt system. She was fighting an empire. You can't fight him directly, Reynolds warned, his voice low, the tension palpable. He has eyes everywhere. His influence runs deep. You need to be strategic. You can't just expose him. He'll crush you before you even get the chance. Sarah's mind was racing. She had come so far, but now, every move seemed fraught with danger. Cartwright was untouchable. He had the connections, the power, and the resources to destroy anyone who stood in his way. But the idea of walking away wasn't an option. I'm not backing down, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear threatening to overtake her. I can't. Reynolds studied her for a moment, his face grim. Then you need to be prepared. This isn't going to be easy. And if you push too hard, you'll end up just like the others, disappearing without a trace. Sarah shook her head, trying to keep her resolve. I've already gone too far. There's no turning back now. Reynolds leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. Fine, but I want you to understand something. There's a price to this. And Cartwright doesn't just fight with money or power. He fights with people. People who will do anything to protect him. If you keep pushing, you'll be stepping into a game that no one can win. And you'll be alone. The finality of his words hit Sarah hard. She was no longer just a judge. She was a target. But there was something else in Reynolds' eyes. A flicker of fear, mixed with something darker. It wasn't just a warning. It was a plea. She knew Reynolds wasn't just concerned about her. He was scared. Scared of Cartwright. Scared of what might happen if Sarah refused to stop. And she understood why. Cartwright's empire wasn't built on kindness. It was built on fear, manipulation, and ruthless control. But Sarah wasn't afraid. Not yet, at least. "I'll handle it," she said quietly, her voice firm. "You've helped me enough already, Reynolds. Now I need to take the next step." Reynolds didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, his expression hardening. "You know where to find me. But be careful. Once you've crossed the line, there's no coming back." That evening, Sarah returned to her apartment, her mind swirling with the weight of everything she had learned. She pulled out the files, the digital evidence, the connections, and began to piece together the final part of the puzzle. There had to be a way to take Cartwright down. She knew he was the key, but she also knew the truth could not come from a single angle. She needed a plan, one that would expose him in a way that left no room for doubt. But the deeper she dug, the more she realized how much was at stake. Exposing Cartwright would be a battle not just against him, but against the entire system he had so carefully constructed. And Sarah wasn't sure the system was one that could be fixed. The deeper she looked, the more her hope dwindled. The corruption wasn't isolated. It was embedded in the very fabric of society. As the night wore on, Sarah became lost in the endless layers of evidence. She was so close, but every step she took seemed to bring more questions. The stakes were higher than ever, but there was one thing she hadn't anticipated. What would happen if she succeeded? If she exposed Cartwright, the backlash would be immense. But there were others who stood to lose just as much. Those who had helped him, those who had turned a blind eye. And those people wouldn't just sit back and let her expose everything. They would fight back. They would do whatever it took to protect their empire. She closed her laptop, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about survival. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that survival might come at a cost she wasn't ready to pay. The next morning, Sarah met with her team of trusted allies. They gathered in a dimly lit office, away from the public eye, and discussed their strategy. There was no room for hesitation. The files were ready, the evidence was in place, but the plan was still taking shape. Every angle needed to be covered. One wrong move, and they would lose everything. "We need leverage," one of the investigators said, his voice rough from hours of discussion. "Cartwright's not going to just roll over. We need something he can't deny." Sarah nodded, already knowing what needed to be done. "We'll use his own system against him. We'll expose the connections, publicly. We'll use the press, the media, and then force his hand. But we need to be ready for him to retaliate. This won't be clean." The room fell silent as everyone processed the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just an investigation. This was an attack, a direct assault on everything Cartwright had built. If they succeeded, it could change everything. But if they failed, it could mean the end of their careers, and possibly their lives. As Sarah looked around the table, she saw the resolve in her team's eyes. They were in this together. But even as they planned, Sarah could feel the weight of the choice she had made pressing down on her. She was committing to a battle that no one could win without sacrificing something. And the question that kept haunting her was this: would the truth be enough? Later that evening, Sarah received another message. It was from Musk. "Meet me tonight. I've got new information. This just got bigger than we thought." She hesitated before replying. The more she got involved with Musk, the less certain she became about who he really was and what his true intentions were. But for now, she had no choice but to trust him. If Musk had information that could bring Cartwright down, she would take it. Her phone buzzed again. "Don't trust anyone, Sarah. Not even me. Watch your back." The words sent a chill down her spine. But she had come too far to turn back now. The war had begun, and there would be no peace until it was over. The night air was heavy with the promise of a storm. Sarah stood at the entrance of the dimly lit bar where Musk had arranged to meet her. She hadn't told anyone where she was going, not even Reynolds. She wasn't sure who she could trust anymore. As much as she wanted to believe in the people who had helped her so far, every conversation, every decision, now seemed clouded with doubt. Her phone's cryptic message, warning her not to trust anyone, had rattled her more than she cared to admit. Was Musk playing her, too? She pushed the thoughts aside. She had come this far. The truth needed to be exposed, no matter the cost. Inside the bar, The faint hum of jazz music filled the space. The low murmur of voices was almost comforting, a stark contrast to the growing tension inside Sarah. She scanned the room, her eyes searching for Musk. He had insisted on meeting in person, away from prying eyes. She spotted him in the back corner, sitting at a small table, looking out of place in his designer suit amidst the casual crowd. He looked up as she approached and motioned for her to sit. "I'm glad you came," Musk said, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "I have something important to tell you." Sarah took a seat across from him, studying him closely. She had worked with him for weeks, trying to piece together the larger conspiracy, but now that she was face to face with him, the discomfort in her gut was hard to ignore. There was something about his cool demeanor that unsettled her. "Before we start, I need to know something," Sarah said, her voice steady, but laced with suspicion. "Are you really on my side?" Musk raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" Sarah leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "You've been feeding me information for weeks, but now I'm wondering, what's in it for you? You're not doing this out of the kindness of your heart. What's your angle?" He didn't flinch, but Sarah could see the shift in his expression. A hint of something unreadable flashed across his face. "You're starting to think like a prosecutor," he said with a half-smile. "That's good. But trust me, I'm on your side." Sarah wasn't convinced. "I hope you can prove it, because right now, everything feels like it's spiraling out of control." Musk took a deep breath, leaning back in his chair. I know you're scared. But the truth is, you're standing on the edge of something much bigger than you realize. The information I'm about to give you, well, it's going to change everything." A rush of anticipation hit Sarah. She had spent so many sleepless nights chasing leads, piecing together information that felt like it was slipping through her fingers. She needed something solid, something that would finally expose the whole system. "You've got my attention," she said. Musk reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He slid it across the table to her, and she opened it carefully. Inside, there were stacks of documents, photos, and maps. She started scanning the first few pages, her heart racing as she realized what she was looking at: detailed evidence linking Lucas Cartwright to numerous illegal activities, ranging from money laundering to insider trading, political manipulation, and more. There were even photographs of Cartwright meeting with foreign dignitaries, suggesting international connections. Sarah felt the weight of the documents in her hands. This was it, the proof she had been desperately searching for. But as she went through the papers, a thought crept into her mind. If Musk had access to all of this, then he was closer to Cartwright than he had let on. "Where did you get this?" Sarah asked, looking up from the pile of evidence. Musk's eyes locked onto hers, his expression unreadable. "Let's just say I have my sources. Cartwright's been running this show for a long time, but he's been careless. His empire is built on secrecy, but cracks are starting to show. These documents are the key to bringing it all down." Sarah's mind was whirling. Everything she had worked for, everything she had risked, was within reach. But there was something that gnawed at her. "And you want me to use this to bring him down," she said, her voice cold. "But why now? Why haven't you done it yourself?" Musk's gaze hardened. "Because I've been trying to, in my own way. But Cartwright isn't someone you can take down with a few well-placed documents. He's too powerful, too connected. If I had gone after him directly, I'd have been eliminated. You, on the other hand, you have something he doesn't expect." Sarah's curiosity piqued. "And what's that?" "You have the law on your side," Musk replied. "The courts, the public, the media, they all trust you. You're a respected judge. You're the perfect person to take this to the next level." Sarah thought about his words. It was true. As a judge, she had a position of power that Cartwright couldn't ignore. But it also put her in a vulnerable spot. If she moved forward with this evidence, she was opening herself up to an attack on multiple fronts. "Why are you helping me?" Sarah asked again, still not satisfied with his answer. Musk paused, his gaze softening for a moment. "Because I can't do this alone, and because I owe it to the people who've suffered because of Cartwright. But mostly," he looked away briefly, a flicker of something passing through his eyes. "Mostly, I want to see him fall." The answer wasn't enough to ease Sarah's concerns, But she knew one thing. Musk was offering her the ammunition she needed. It was now up to her to use it wisely. "I'll take it from here," she said, her voice firm. "But this isn't just about exposing Cartwright anymore. It's about survival. He won't go down quietly, and neither will the people he's got on his side." Musk nodded, his expression hardening. "I know. But now that you have this, you've got the leverage you need to make a move." Sarah stood up, the envelope of evidence clutched tightly in her hands. She had a plan. She would expose Cartwright, and she would do it in a way that no one could ignore. But she knew that the moment she took that step, there would be no turning back. The forces she was up against weren't just powerful, they were ruthless. And the higher she climbed, the more enemies she would make. But Sarah wasn't afraid. She had a mission, and it was a mission she couldn't abandon. Cartwright was about to learn that you didn't always have to play by his rules. The game had just changed. The following days felt like a blur for Sarah. The weight of the evidence in the manila envelope hung over her like a storm cloud, ominous and unavoidable. She had the power to destroy Lucas Cartwright, to tear down the empire he had built over decades of deception. But the more she thought about the risks, the more the dread settled in her chest. The truth was, Cartwright wasn't just a businessman. He was the puppet master behind a sprawling network of corruption that ran through the highest echelons of power. Taking him down wasn't just about exposing his crimes. It was about dismantling a system that had protected him for years. She sat at her desk late one night, reviewing the documents Musk had given her. The names, the dates, the accounts. Each one was a thread in a vast web of deceit. She could feel her pulse quicken with each new revelation. She was getting closer, closer to the truth, but every step forward felt like stepping deeper into quicksand. The further she went, the more it felt like she might be pulled under. But there was no turning back. The phone buzzed on her desk, snapping her out of her thoughts. The number was unlisted, but something in the pit of her stomach told her it was important. She picked up the phone, her hand slightly trembling. "Sarah," a voice on the other end said. It was Reynolds. "Reynolds? What's going on?" she asked, her voice tense. "We don't have much time," Reynolds replied, his voice low and urgent. "Cartwright knows you're getting close. He's already making moves to shut you down." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? How does he know?" Reynolds hesitated, then spoke in a whisper. "I've been keeping an eye on things, and it looks like your investigation has already caught his attention. He's had people tailing you, and now he's going after those close to you. Be careful, Sarah. He won't just go after you. He'll go after anyone you care about." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Cartwright wasn't just a threat to her career. He was a threat to her life. And now, he was making it personal. "I'll be careful," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the rising panic. "But I need to know more. What's he planning?" "I'm not sure yet," Reynolds said, "but I have a few contacts who might know. Meet me tonight. I'll give you what I've got." Sarah didn't hesitate. She couldn't afford to waste any more time. "I'll be there," she said, hanging up the phone. That night, Sarah met Reynolds in a quiet, dimly lit restaurant on the outskirts of town. He was waiting for her in a corner booth, looking more agitated than usual. As Sarah slid into the seat across from him, she could see the lines of worry etched deep into his face. "What's going on, Reynolds?" she asked, her voice urgent. "Tell me what you know." Reynolds glanced around the room, ensuring no one was listening before he leaned in closer. "Cartwright's not just watching you. He's got people everywhere, on your team, in the media, even in law enforcement. If you think you're safe, you're not. He's already made moves to discredit you, to turn people against you. He's putting pressure on everyone in your orbit." Sarah clenched her fists, the gravity of the situation hitting her all at once. "So he's already playing dirty." Reynolds nodded grimly. "This is just the beginning. He'll stop at nothing to protect himself. He's got the power to make people disappear. If you keep pushing forward, you'll be painted as the villain. The media will turn on you. The courts will turn on you. And you'll lose everything." Sarah felt the weight of Reynolds' words sink in. It wasn't just about Cartwright being a powerful businessman anymore. It was about him having a whole army of people who would stop at nothing to protect him. If she continued, she would be walking straight into a war that she might not survive. But something inside Sarah hardened. She had spent her career fighting for justice. She had stood in the courtroom, fought the tough cases, and upheld the law. She wasn't about to back down just because the stakes had been raised. "I won't back down," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm not going to let him win." Reynolds sighed, looking at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "I knew you'd say that, but you need to be smarter than this. Cartwright isn't a man you can just confront head-on. You need to play this carefully. Every move you make needs to be calculated. He's already making plans to discredit you. We need to beat him at his own game." Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I've got the evidence," she said, pulling out the manila envelope from her bag. "I've got the proof of his crimes, but I know it's not enough. I need to be able to take him down completely." Reynolds looked at the envelope with a mix of awe and fear. "If this gets out, it's over for him. But it's also over for you. You have to be prepared for the fallout. Cartwright will come after everyone involved, and I'm not just talking about you." Sarah nodded, knowing he was right. She couldn't just expose Cartwright and expect it to be over. She had to think bigger, work smarter. She had to bring down his entire empire, and that meant taking out more than just the man at the top. "We need to hit him where it hurts," Sarah said, her mind already racing with ideas. "We need to expose not just Cartwright, but everyone who's been working with him. I'll take this to the press, but I need to make sure they'll be on my side. I need to make it impossible for him to fight back." Reynolds gave a low whistle. "You're talking about taking down an entire system. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Sarah leaned back, her gaze unwavering. "I've been ready for this my whole life." Reynolds stared at her for a long moment, as if considering her resolve. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'll help you. But you have to promise me something. When this goes down, we stick together, no matter what happens. Because once you cross that line, there's no going back." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She knew what this meant. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a war. But she wasn't afraid. If Cartwright wanted a fight, she would give it to him. And she wouldn't stop until she had exposed every last piece of his empire. "I promise," Sarah said, her voice firm, "and we'll win." As Sarah walked out of the restaurant and into the cold night, she could feel the weight of the decision she had just made settling on her shoulders. The storm was coming. She could hear the distant rumble of thunder, as if the world itself was warning her. But Sarah wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. It was time to take the fight to Cartwright. And this time, she wasn't going to play by his rules. Sarah spent the following days preparing herself for the storm that was fast approaching. She couldn't afford to waste any more time. Reynolds had given her a list of contacts, individuals who could help her in her fight against Cartwright. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she couldn't trust just anyone. Cartwright's influence stretched far and wide, and she had no idea who might be working with him behind the scenes. Trust had become a rare commodity in this game. She sat in her office late one evening, staring at the piles of evidence Musk had provided, the weight of the documents pressing on her. It felt as if the walls were closing in around her. Cartwright was a formidable adversary, and he had resources at his disposal that Sarah couldn't even fathom. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a kingpin in a corrupt empire, and his reach was global. Every move she made would be met with fierce opposition, and if she was not careful, it could cost her everything. The phone rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. She answered it without hesitation. "Sarah," Reynolds said urgently, his voice strained. "Cartwright's making his move. He knows you've got the evidence. He's already started a smear campaign. The media's starting to turn on you. You need to act fast, or they'll bury you before you get a chance to fight back." Sarah's blood ran cold. She had feared this moment, but now that it was here, the reality of it was even worse than she'd imagined. "How bad is it?" she asked, her voice tight. "Bad," Reynolds replied. "They've got sources inside the media, and they're already spinning the narrative. They're painting you as the villain, accusing you of corruption, bias, and even of being part of Cartwright's scheme. If you don't fight back now, the public will turn on you." Sarah's mind raced. She knew this day was coming, but she hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. Cartwright had resources, but she had something he didn't: the truth. It was time to take control of the narrative before it was too late. "I'm going to the press," Sarah said, her voice firm. "I'll expose him for everything he is. If the media wants a story, I'll give them one they can't ignore." "You can't just walk into a press conference and start dropping bombshells, Sarah," Reynolds warned. "Cartwright's already planting people in the media to undermine you. You need a strategy, and you need backup." "I don't have time for a strategy," Sarah shot back, her patience wearing thin. "If I wait any longer, they'll have buried me by then." Reynolds let out a frustrated sigh. "Fine, but if you're going to do this, you need to be prepared. You need allies, people who can back you up, and you need to take this to the right people. Don't just go to the media. Go to the ones who can expose him for real. The ones with power, the ones who can fight back against him." Sarah was already dialing the number of a trusted reporter, someone she had worked with in the past, someone who had never backed down from a fight. The moment the phone connected, she didn't waste any time. "I need you to listen carefully," she said. "I have evidence that will take down one of the most powerful men in the country. But I can't do this alone. If I give you what I've got, you need to make sure it gets the attention it deserves. Cartwright's people are already in motion, and if I don't get this out now, it's over." The reporter on the other end was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure about this, Sarah?" she asked, her voice cautious. "You know what's at stake." "I know," Sarah replied, her resolve hardening. "But this isn't just about me anymore. This is about taking down a system that's been corrupt for too long. And if you don't help me, then Cartwright wins." There was a long pause before the reporter spoke again. "All right, I'll help, but we need to act fast. Give me the evidence, and I'll get it into the right hands. I'll make sure Cartwright can't hide behind his influence any longer." Sarah exhaled, feeling a small but crucial weight lift from her shoulders. She had taken the first step, and now there was no turning back. "I'm sending it to you. And thank you." She hung up the phone and quickly gathered the evidence, preparing to send it off. But as she was about to make the final call to Reynolds, her phone buzzed again. It was an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat. Whoever was calling her now, it couldn't be good. She answered it, her voice cold. "Sarah here." "Judge Collins," a low voice said, a tone of mockery in it. "I hope you're enjoying your time in the spotlight, because it's about to get a whole lot brighter." The hair on the back of Sarah's neck stood up. It was Cartwright. She could tell by the venom in his voice. "Do you really think you can take me down, Sarah?" Cartwright continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "You have no idea what you're up against. You've played your hand, and now you're going to pay the price." Sarah's blood ran cold, but she didn't let him hear her fear. "I'm not afraid of you, Cartwright. You'll be exposed for the criminal you are." There was a short, dark laugh on the other end. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. You think your little press conference is going to save you? You're a pawn, Sarah. A small, insignificant pawn in a much bigger game." "I'll be the one to checkmate you," Sarah replied, her voice steady and unwavering. "You can try to intimidate me all you want, but it won't work. The truth is out there now. People will know what you did." Cartwright's laughter stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was silence. Then he spoke, his voice dangerously low. "You've made a mistake, Sarah. A big one. I'll see to it that you never work again, and I'll make sure you regret ever crossing me." Before Sarah could respond, the line went dead. She stood there, the phone still pressed to her ear, her hands trembling. The threat was real. Cartwright wasn't just a man who played dirty. He was someone who would destroy everything in his path to keep his secrets hidden. But Sarah wasn't going to let that happen. The time for hiding was over. The battle had begun, and she was ready to fight. The next morning, Sarah stood in front of her mirror, staring at her reflection. Her face was pale, her eyes dark with sleepless nights, but her resolve was clearer than ever. The call from Cartwright had shaken her, but it hadn't broken her. If anything, it had solidified her determination to bring him down. He wanted a fight, and she was prepared to give him one he would never forget. As she walked into the courthouse later that day, she felt the weight of every step she took. The halls, usually filled with familiar faces and the hum of legal business, now felt oppressive. Every corner, every shadow seemed to hide enemies, and she was keenly aware that Cartwright's reach was more extensive than she had realized. Her phone buzzed, snapping her from her thoughts. It was Reynolds. "I've got eyes on the media," he said without preamble. "They're running a piece today, taking you down. It's already getting traction. Your name's being dragged through the mud." Sarah clenched her jaw. "I know. Cartwright's behind it, isn't he?" "Yeah," Reynolds replied, his voice tight with frustration. "He's not wasting any time. But here's the thing. His people are everywhere. We've got to get ahead of this before it snowballs." "I've got the press conference set up," Sarah said, her voice steely. "I'm going to expose everything. I'll take it directly to the public. The media can't ignore the truth." "Are you sure about this?" Reynolds asked. "You know they're going to come at you hard. Cartwright's already positioning himself as the victim. He's got the upper hand when it comes to manipulating the narrative." "I don't care," Sarah shot back, her eyes flashing with determination. "He's not going to control this anymore. I've spent my career fighting for the law. It's time I put everything on the line for it." There was a long pause before Reynolds spoke again, his tone softer. "Just be careful. We both know what Cartwright's capable of, and you're about to make yourself a target. You need to have everything locked down before you go public." "I will," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "I've got a plan, and this time, I'm not going to back down." She hung up and took a deep breath. It was time. She wasn't going to let Cartwright or anyone else control her fate. She had the evidence. Now she needed to make sure the right people saw it. Later that afternoon, Sarah stood before the cameras in a small but well-lit conference room. The press corps had gathered, reporters adjusting their microphones, taking notes, and muttering amongst themselves. She could see the skepticism in their eyes, the doubt, the questions. They had already been fed Cartwright's version of events. It was up to her to shatter that narrative and set the record straight. As she stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. Sarah's eyes scanned the crowd of reporters. This wasn't just about exposing Cartwright. It was about standing her ground. This was her moment to make sure that the truth would be heard, no matter the cost. "Good afternoon," Sarah began, her voice calm but carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. "I stand before you today not just as a judge, but as someone who believes in the integrity of the law, someone who has spent their life fighting for justice. But lately, I've come to realize that justice isn't always as clear-cut as it seems." She paused, letting her words sink in. The reporters were leaning in, their attention peaked. There are powerful people who believe they can bend the law to their will, that they can escape the consequences of their actions. And today, I'm here to tell you that one of those people is Lucas Cartwright. A murmur rippled through the room, and Sarah could feel the air shift. This was it. She was drawing the line in the sand. "I have in my possession a collection of evidence that links Mr. Cartwright to a vast network of criminal activities, ranging from money laundering to political manipulation. And it's not just hearsay or speculation. These are documents, photos, and testimonies from people who've been directly involved with him." She could see the surprise on some of their faces. This was bigger than they had anticipated. She wasn't just taking down a businessman. She was about to expose a criminal empire. "I know that many of you have already heard Cartwright's side of the story, but now you'll hear mine. The truth. I will not be silenced, and I will not be intimidated. Cartwright has used his wealth and influence to control everything and everyone around him. But it's time for that to end." A sharp intake of breath echoed through the room. Sarah had just thrown down the gauntlet. "I'm not just standing here to accuse a man of his crimes. I'm standing here because I believe in the power of truth. And I believe that when the truth comes out, it will be impossible for anyone, no matter how powerful, to keep it hidden." The reporters were scribbling furiously, their questions poised on the tip of their tongues. Sarah could feel the intensity in the room. She was opening a door that couldn't be closed again. But then, just as she was about to continue, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't need to check it to know it was Reynolds. Her instincts told her that whatever was happening, it was not good. She ignored the phone for the moment, determined to keep her focus. "I will release these documents to the public, and I will cooperate fully with law enforcement. No one is above the law, not Lucas Cartwright, not anyone." And then, the first question came, the sharp edge of skepticism in it. "Judge Collins, why should the public believe you?" Cartwright's team is already accusing you of being part of his scheme. There are rumors about your involvement with him. How do you respond to that? Sarah met the reporter's gaze, her eyes unwavering. The accusations are nothing but distractions. Cartwright is trying to smear my name because he knows he's guilty. He's trying to save himself by taking me down, but I won't let that happen. The truth speaks for itself. The room buzzed with whispers, but Sarah held her ground. She wasn't just answering questions. She was making her stand. Before she could continue, the door to the room opened with a soft creak. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she saw a familiar figure step into the room. Reynolds, his face drawn with concern. His presence in this moment was unexpected, but it was also a stark reminder of how high the stakes had become. "Sarah," Reynolds said, his voice low as he approached the podium. "We've got a problem." A chill swept through Sarah. "What's happened?" "Cartwright's people are already mobilizing," Reynolds replied, his voice urgent. "They've been sending threats to key people who could corroborate your evidence. And one of them just disappeared." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Who?" Reynolds swallowed hard. "Lena Hartfield. She was a whistleblower, one of the people who worked for Cartwright. She had first-hand knowledge of the money laundering operations. She was supposed to meet with me today, but she never showed up. Her apartment's been ransacked." Sarah's mind raced. This was bigger than she'd realized. If Cartwright was moving this quickly, he was starting to play dirty, really dirty. And Lena's disappearance was a clear message. Cartwright wasn't just going to let her tear down his empire without consequences. "We need to act fast," Sarah said, her voice steady but sharp. "I'll release the evidence now. We can't wait for him to make the next move. It's time we hit him where it hurts, head on." Reynolds nodded grimly, his eyes hard. "Let's make sure he knows we're not backing down." As Sarah turned to face the cameras once more, she knew this was just the beginning. Cartwright would do anything to stop her, but she wasn't going to stop now. The truth had been set in motion, and nothing could stop it from coming to light. Not even Cartwright. The room was thick with tension, a storm of uncertainty swirling around Sarah. As the press conference ended, she could feel the weight of the eyes on her. Reporters, law enforcement, the public, and, most ominously, Cartwright's network of influence. But even as the questions flooded in and the cameras flashed, a deep, gnawing anxiety settled in her chest. Lena was gone. Cartwright was making his move, and if Sarah wasn't careful, the next person to disappear could be her. After the conference, Sarah rushed back to her office, the sound of her heels clicking sharply against the marble floors. Reynolds was already there, his face set in grim determination. "We need to move fast," he said, not wasting any time with pleasantries. "The media's running with your story, some of it's positive, but Cartwright's people are already hitting back hard. They're controlling the narrative. If we don't stay ahead of this, we'll lose everything." Sarah's pulse quickened. She'd known this would happen, but now the reality was crashing in. Cartwright was no ordinary adversary. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a master manipulator, and his tentacles of influence stretched deep into every corner of society, including the media. Every move she made was being watched. Every step she took would be met with resistance. "I've been thinking about Lena," Sarah said, her voice low. "She was key. She had access to the files we need. If Cartwright's after her, that means he's trying to erase the evidence." Reynolds nodded. "Exactly. And that's why we can't waste any more time. We need to find Lena, fast. She's the only one who can corroborate the documents you've got. Without her, Cartwright will have the upper hand." "Do you think he's already gone after her?" Sarah asked, her mind racing. "It's possible," Reynolds said, running a hand through his hair. "But it's also possible he's playing a longer game, making sure she's too scared to speak. We need to find her before that happens." Sarah's thoughts were a whirlwind. Lena had been their best shot. Someone on the inside who could confirm everything they'd uncovered about Cartwright's operations. She was the missing piece of the puzzle, and now she was gone. "Where do we even start looking for her?" Sarah asked. "She could be anywhere by now." Reynolds paused, clearly deep in thought. "We have to think like Cartwright. If she was the weak link, he'd want to neutralize her in a way that didn't attract attention. He's always been careful, playing his moves strategically." Sarah's mind clicked into gear, which means he'd hide her somewhere nobody would expect. Not in a public place, but somewhere private, isolated. A safe house, maybe. Somewhere off the radar. Reynolds' eyes lit up as he caught her drift. There's a place I know. An old facility Cartwright used years ago when he was running his early operations. It's not on any official maps. If Lena's been taken, it's the kind of place Cartwright would use to keep her out of sight. Sarah didn't hesitate. Let's go. Now. They drove for hours, the cityscape eventually giving way to the desolate stretch of road that led to the facility. The further they went, the more Sarah could feel the heaviness in the air. This wasn't just a search for a missing person. It was a race against time. Cartwright was making his final moves, and Sarah knew that if he succeeded in silencing Lena, he would have won. But if they could find her and get the information she had, they could finally bring him down for good. The facility was hidden deep in the woods, the overgrown trees and abandoned buildings giving it an air of complete isolation. The place looked forgotten, almost like something out of a ghost story. Sarah's stomach churned as they approached the crumbling building at the heart of the complex. "Stay close," Reynolds warned, his voice low. "This place is more than just abandoned. Cartwright's people know how to disappear here." Sarah nodded, her hand instinctively reaching for the concealed weapon she'd carried with her for months. She had no idea what they might find inside, but she couldn't afford to be caught off guard. They moved cautiously through the facility's dark, musty corridors, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the silence. Every door they passed, every shadow they encountered, felt like it could hold an answer or a threat. Then, in the distance, they heard the faintest sound, a muffled scream. Without hesitation, they ran toward it. They reached a steel door, the source of the noise, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know if it was Lena, but the sound was unmistakable, a cry of distress, desperate and filled with fear. "On three," Reynolds whispered, positioning himself next to the door. "1, 2, 3. He kicked the door open, and they rushed inside, weapons drawn. What they saw wasn't what they expected. Lena was there, huddled in a corner, her hands bound and her face bruised. But she wasn't alone. Standing over her, grinning darkly, was one of Cartwright's men, a hulking figure with a sinister look in his eyes. "Get away from her," Sarah shouted, her voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. The man turned slowly, his smile widening as he recognized her. Well, if it isn't the infamous Judge Collins," he sneered. "You're just as foolish as I thought. You really think you can take down Cartwright? You've already lost." He reached for a gun at his side, but before he could draw it, Sarah was already moving. She lunged forward, knocking the weapon out of his hand in one swift motion. A fight broke out, a flurry of punches and struggles, but Sarah was driven by something deeper than fear. She was driven by the truth, by everything she had fought for. With a final, forceful shove, she sent the man crashing to the floor, unconscious. Reynolds moved quickly, cutting Lena's binds and pulling her into a protective embrace. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Lena looked up, her eyes wide with fear and gratitude. "I thought I was done for," she whispered, her voice shaky. "But I knew you'd come for me." Sarah nodded, her heart racing as she helped Lena to her feet. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice resolute. "But we're closer than ever. We've got the evidence, and now we have you. Let's make sure Cartwright never hurts anyone again." Lena gave a weak smile. "I'm ready. Let's end this." Sarah's eyes hardened with determination. They had the final piece. They had Lena's testimony, and they had the truth on their side. But Cartwright wouldn't go down without a fight. The final battle was about to begin, and Sarah was prepared to take him on. The air in the car was thick with anticipation as Sarah, Reynolds, and Lena drove back from the abandoned facility. The city was just a few hours away, but the gravity of what had happened felt like an eternity. They had rescued Lena, but Sarah knew that Cartwright wasn't going to let this slip by. The pieces were falling into place, too many pieces. The truth was finally within their grasp, but with it came a new level of danger. Lena was slumped in the back seat, her eyes distant, but at least she wasn't alone anymore. She was safe, for now. Reynolds, his eyes scanning the road ahead, was unusually quiet. He knew as well as Sarah that this was far from over. "We need to get this information to the authorities before Cartwright makes another move," Sarah said, breaking the silence. Her voice was sharp, but there was an underlying tension there. She knew the moment they made their move, Cartwright would do everything in his power to stop them. Reynolds glanced in the rearview mirror. "Yeah, but we can't just waltz into the police station. Cartwright's people have eyes everywhere. If we tip him off, we might as well be handing him the evidence on a silver platter." Sarah's jaw tightened. She had been thinking the same thing. "We need to go underground. Make sure we're not being followed. We need to get Lena's statement first and make sure everything is sealed tight before we approach anyone. We can't afford to make a mistake." Lena shifted in the back seat, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never should have gotten involved with Cartwright, but he knew how to manipulate people, make them feel like they had no choice." "We know," Reynolds replied, his tone softening, "but you're not alone anymore. We're going to make sure he pays for what he's done." Lena nodded, but there was an obvious fear still lingering in her eyes. "I'm not worried about him anymore. I'm worried about what he's going to do when he finds out I'm talking to you. He's not going to just walk away." Sarah turned her head, locking eyes with Lena through the rearview mirror. "That's exactly why we're doing this the right way. We'll get your statement, and then we'll take everything straight to the right people. People Cartwright can't control. We've got him cornered." But deep down, Sarah knew that even with the truth in hand, there was one thing that could still derail everything: Cartwright's reach. He had connections everywhere, from politicians to law enforcement to the media. No one was beyond his influence. They arrived at a secluded safe house, a location only known to Reynolds and a few trusted allies. It was a small, nondescript building tucked away in the middle of a quiet neighborhood. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of passing traffic. The perfect place to lay low and get to work. Inside, Sarah took charge, sitting Lena down at a table while Reynolds stood guard by the door, watching the street outside for any sign of danger. Sarah spread out the files they had recovered, flipping through the documents that detailed Cartwright's illegal activities: money laundering, bribery, corporate fraud. The list was long, but it was also the blueprint of the empire Cartwright had built. Lena, still recovering from her ordeal, finally spoke up. "There's more. He's been building a network of people for years, people who don't even know who they're working for. He has people in every corner: private security, politicians, business owners. He's untouchable unless someone exposes him." "That's exactly what we're going to do," Sarah said, her voice steady. "But we need everything. We can't afford to leave any loose ends. We have to show that Cartwright is not just a criminal businessman. We need to show he's the mastermind behind a whole web of corruption." Lena nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she sifted through more files. "I can give you the names. I can give you the dates, the locations. I've seen everything firsthand. I helped him hide the money, move it from one account to another. I know the people he's working with." "Good," Sarah said. "This is exactly what we need. We'll make sure the evidence is airtight." But as Lena spoke, Sarah felt the nagging sense that time was running out. They had everything they needed, but there was still something lingering in the back of her mind. Cartwright wasn't stupid. He knew they were coming for him, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. The night stretched on as Lena recounted every detail she could remember. The hours passed in a blur of names and dates, but the more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Cartwright's criminal network was far larger than they had ever imagined. Every time they thought they had a lead, they uncovered another layer of his operations. Just as Sarah was about to wrap things up for the night, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from an unknown number: "Stop what you're doing, or people will start dying." Her heart skipped a beat. Cartwright's warning had come faster than she expected, and it was exactly as she feared. He was already onto them. Reynolds, who had been scanning the files across the room, turned sharply. "What's wrong?" Sarah showed him the message, her face hardening. "Cartwright's making his move. He knows we're coming for him." "We can't wait any longer," Reynolds said, grabbing his jacket and moving toward the door. "We need to get this to the right people. We've got to act now, before he does something drastic." Sarah clenched her jaw, her mind racing. It's too risky. If Cartwright's got eyes everywhere, someone's bound to tip him off. Reynolds shook his head. We've gone too far to back out now. We need to make sure this is in the hands of the right people, people who can take him down for good. A tense silence filled the room, the weight of their decision heavy in the air. They were on the brink of a war, one that would put everything they held dear on the line. And Sarah knew that there was no turning back. They had to expose Cartwright, or he would keep destroying lives, manipulating the system for his own gain. But as the hours ticked by, Sarah realized one undeniable truth. Exposing Cartwright wouldn't just be a fight for justice. It would be a battle for survival. Sarah sat at the kitchen table in the safe house, her fingers tracing the edges of the stack of documents in front of her. The files felt heavier than before, as if each piece of paper carried the weight of everything she had worked for and everything she was about to lose. Cartwright wasn't just an adversary. He was a monster, hiding behind layers of power, influence, and wealth. His reach was far greater than she had ever imagined, and as the minutes ticked by, the danger of their situation became increasingly clear. Reynolds, we can't keep operating like this. He's watching every move we make, Sarah muttered, more to herself than anyone else in the room. Reynolds, pacing the floor, stopped to look at her. You're right. We've already taken a huge risk by bringing Lena in. We don't have the luxury of waiting for things to get easier. Cartwright is already planning his next strike. If we don't act now, we'll be too late. Lena, sitting on the couch, looked up, her face drawn and weary. I thought if I kept quiet, maybe he'd leave me alone. But he's not the kind of man who forgets. He won't stop until everyone who's a threat is gone. Sarah's gaze softened as she walked over to Lena. You're not alone anymore. You helped us, and we're going to make sure he pays for what he's done. But we need to be smart about this. If Cartwright has people on the inside, Reynolds interrupted, his voice low and serious. He does. I've been thinking about that. Cartwright's empire isn't just built on corruption. It's built on trust and betrayal. He's got people in every corner. Law enforcement, the government, even some people within the media. We've been playing into his hands without even realizing it. The realization hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just Cartwright's men who were the problem. The system that was supposed to protect them might very well be working against them. Who could they trust? Who could they even turn to for help? We can't afford to trust anyone right now, Reynolds continued. We need to go completely off the grid. Get the evidence to the right people, but carefully. There's too much at stake. Lena's voice trembled. How can we even be sure who the right people are? If Cartwright's network is that extensive, how do we know he doesn't have a mole inside the very agency that's supposed to be helping us? Sarah turned to face Lena, her thoughts swirling. It was a fair question. Even law enforcement, the one thing that had always been a pillar of hope for Sarah, might be compromised. In a world this corrupted, it was impossible to trust anyone at face value. I've been thinking, Sarah said, her mind working overtime. There's one person I know who might still be trustworthy. One person who's been trying to take Cartwright down for years, but who couldn't get enough leverage. A man named Detective Will Matthews. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Matthews? He's been in the game for a long time. But why would he be able to help now when no one else could? Sarah leaned in, her voice steady despite the uncertainty gnawing at her. Because Matthews has his own reasons for wanting Cartwright behind bars. He's been a thorn in Cartwright's side for years, but every time he gets close, Cartwright's people shut him down. But he's been gathering evidence on his own. Small pieces, not enough to bring the whole house down, but enough to make Cartwright nervous. Lena frowned. How do you know you can trust him? Sarah's eyes met Lena's. I don't, but I'm willing to take that risk. We don't have many options left. Reynolds rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Matthews may be the key, but there's no way he's going to take on Cartwright's empire by himself. If we give him this evidence, he'll be putting himself in the line of fire too. If we make this move, it's all or nothing. Sarah nodded. Exactly. But we need to do it the right way. No mess-ups. Cartwright can't find out until it's too late. We're going to move fast, and we're going to do it with precision. The decision was made, and the plan was set into motion. The next morning, Sarah, Reynolds, and Lena packed up what they needed and left the safe house under the cover of early morning fog. The streets were quiet, the world still asleep as they navigated the backroads to avoid being spotted. Sarah's thoughts were sharp and focused, but anxiety lingered in the pit of her stomach. Matthews was their best shot at getting Cartwright, but they still had no idea what kind of response Cartwright was preparing. If Matthews didn't play his cards right, it could be the end for all of them. They arrived at Matthews's office, a small, run-down building tucked away in a quieter part of the city. The place was unassuming, almost hidden in plain sight. The perfect place for someone who didn't want to be noticed. Sarah knocked twice on the door before it creaked open. Matthews stood in the doorway, his eyes narrowing when he saw who it was. He was a tall man, older, with a rugged demeanor that came from years on the force. His face was weathered, lined with age and exhaustion, but there was still fire behind his eyes. "What the hell are you doing here?" Matthews growled, his voice low. "We need your help," Sarah said, her voice calm but insistent. "We've got everything we need to take down Cartwright." Matthews's eyes flicked to the others in the room. "You know, I've been trying to do this for years. But Cartwright's untouchable. His people are everywhere. If you've got something that can finally bring him down, I'm listening. But I'm not going to risk my career, my life, on some half-baked plan." Reynolds stepped forward, holding up a folder filled with documents. "This isn't just some plan. We've got names, dates, locations. We've got proof that Cartwright is more than just a businessman. He's the kingpin behind a criminal empire. We've got the evidence to bring him down for good." Matthews hesitated, taking the folder from Reynolds and flipping through the documents quickly. His expression shifted as he read, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. This is the real deal." "It is," Sarah said, "and it's all in your hands now. But we need to move quickly. Cartwright knows we're coming for him, and if we don't act fast, we'll be too late." Matthews looked up from the folder, his face hardening. "All right, I'm in, but if we're doing this, we do it my way. Cartwright's people are already out there. They've got eyes everywhere. If you want him gone, we're going to need a team." Sarah took a deep breath. "Let's get to work." The battle for justice had officially begun, but as Sarah looked at the folder in Matthews's hands, she couldn't shake the feeling that the enemy was already closer than they realized. The weeks that followed were filled with a constant hum of tension. The plan was set in motion, but Sarah knew that at any moment, Cartwright could strike back. Every decision felt like a game of chess, and Sarah had to stay one step ahead, or they'd be out of moves. Detective Matthews had begun assembling a team, handpicking a few trusted officers who weren't yet compromised by Cartwright's influence. The group was small, but they were determined. Matthews had access to resources, but the challenge was overwhelming. Cartwright's empire was vast, its roots deep in every level of power, from politicians to law enforcement to business magnates. Every name on the list was another potential target, and it felt like every lead led to another layer of secrecy. The city buzzed with the undercurrent of something building, but the truth was they weren't just going after Cartwright. They were trying to expose a system that had been corrupted beyond recognition. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. One evening, after a long day of work, Sarah found herself alone in the office, staring at the wall of evidence that was now plastered across the room. The names, the dates, the financial trails, they were all there, but the pieces still didn't add up. Something was missing. She rubbed her temples, trying to focus, when Matthews walked in, his face grim. "Sarah," he said quietly, shutting the door behind him, "I've been thinking about what you said. About Cartwright's network." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes tired but sharp. "And?" Matthews leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "It's bigger than we thought. We've been going after the people we know, but Cartwright's network isn't just limited to what's visible. He's got allies in places we haven't even begun to look." Sarah's heart sank. "What do you mean?" He pushed off the doorframe and walked over to the table where the evidence was spread out. "I mean that the corruption is deeper. Cartwright's empire didn't just grow on its own. He's had help from people on the inside, people we trusted, people in high places who have been covering his tracks for years. We've been focusing on the surface, but we need to go after the root." Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "Are you saying that some of our own team, People we've been working with might be compromised? Matthews met her gaze. I'm afraid so. There are whispers, Sarah. Whispers of high-level operatives, officers, even politicians who've been getting paid off. I don't know who they are yet, but we can't afford to ignore it. The weight of his words hung heavily in the room. Sarah knew that they had been playing a dangerous game, but now it seemed as though the odds were even more stacked against them. If they couldn't trust the people they had been relying on, who could they turn to? We need to start with the money, Sarah said, her mind already racing. Follow the financial trails. Look for anomalies. That's where we'll find the connections we're missing. If Cartwright's been paying people off, we need to track that flow. We'll find the key players in the system that are shielding him. Matthews nodded. I've been working with a couple of tech experts who might be able to help us dig into his digital footprint. But we need to be careful. The deeper we go, the more exposed we'll be. I know, Sarah said, but we're out of time. Cartwright knows we're getting closer. We can't wait around any longer. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and data sifting. Sarah spent hours in the back office, piecing together the financial records, cross-referencing names, dates, and accounts, trying to connect the dots that would finally bring Cartwright's empire to its knees. But every time they thought they had found something solid, it slipped through their fingers, like water running through their hands. But just as Sarah was about to give up for the night, a breakthrough came. A wire transfer. It was small, barely noticeable in the sea of transactions, but it was enough. It led her to a shell company, one that appeared to be a legitimate business on the surface but was tied to several corrupt officials. The company was being used to funnel money that could lead them straight to Cartwright's higher-ups. Sarah's pulse quickened. This is it, she whispered to herself. She printed out the transaction details and immediately called Matthews. Matthews was already on his way to meet with his tech team. What's the news? He asked, his voice crackling through the phone. I found something. A wire transfer. It's not much, but it's a link to a shell company, and I'm betting it's a gateway to the real power behind Cartwright. This could be the key to breaking this whole thing wide open. I'm on my way to meet with the team. We'll track it down, Matthews said. Keep me posted. But remember, once we go after this, we can't go back. Cartwright will know. He'll make his move. The team gathered in a secure location, each person focused on a different part of the puzzle. The atmosphere was tense, but there was an undeniable spark of hope. If they could just follow this lead, they could expose Cartwright and everything he stood for. As Matthews sat at the head of the table, he looked at the gathered faces, his team, their only hope for taking Cartwright down. The weight of the mission hung heavy on them all. This is bigger than anything we've tackled before, he said. We get this right and Cartwright's done. But if we miss a single step, it's over. Are we ready? There was no hesitation. We're ready, Sarah said, her voice steady. Lena, who had been quietly sitting in the corner, nodded in agreement. I'm ready. Let's do this. The following hours were a whirlwind of activity. The tech team was able to trace the shell company's ownership to a series of offshore accounts that tied directly to politicians, law enforcement officials, and business moguls, all of whom were deeply connected to Cartwright's operations. But the breakthrough came when they discovered something even more troubling. Cartwright had been laundering money through these accounts for years, building a financial empire that stretched far beyond the reaches of what they had initially believed. Each link in the chain was a new revelation, and as Sarah pieced it all together, she realized just how massive the scope of the conspiracy really was. And yet, despite the mounting evidence, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was as though Cartwright had eyes everywhere, always one step ahead. Every new piece of evidence was a victory, but with each success came the fear of what Cartwright might do next. As the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Sarah looked at her team. This is it. We have what we need. Now we just need to figure out how to get this in front of the right people. But even as the words left her mouth, the weight of the decision pressed down on her shoulders. If they were wrong, if they trusted the wrong people, everything they had worked for could come crashing down in an instant. And Cartwright, with all his power and influence, would be right there to pick up the pieces. The hours felt like days as Sarah and her team rushed to finalize the evidence they had gathered. Matthews's team had compiled everything into a secure digital file, encrypted with layers of protection, and they were now making their final preparations to distribute the information. The plan was simple. Take the evidence to the right people in government, the ones they could trust, and let them handle it. But as Sarah sat in the dimly lit room, staring at the screen in front of her, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. This was it, the endgame. They were so close to taking down Cartwright, but the nagging sense that they had overlooked something critical gnawed at her. "You're quiet," Reynolds said, breaking into her thoughts. He had been pacing the room, unable to sit still as the tension mounted. "I keep thinking we missed something," Sarah admitted, her voice low, almost to herself. "Something small, something that might unravel everything we've done." Reynolds stopped pacing and sat next to her. "We've done everything we can. We've got the evidence. We've got Matthews's team behind us, and we've got a plan. This is our shot." "I know," she said, rubbing her eyes, "but it feels like it's not enough. Cartwright is too powerful. If we don't move quickly, he'll find a way to bury us." Matthews had gone to great lengths to arrange the meeting with the right people, his old contacts in law enforcement who hadn't been bought by Cartwright. There weren't many left, but Matthews had a reputation of his own, one that Cartwright couldn't erase, no matter how much money or power he had. Sarah trusted Matthews, but the looming sense of danger kept her on edge. They were taking a massive risk. "I just hope we're not walking into a trap," Sarah murmured, staring at the door as if she expected Cartwright's goons to burst in at any moment. "You've done everything right," Reynolds said, trying to reassure her. "You've got a team that's loyal. We've accounted for every possible angle. I just wish I could shake the feeling that there's something we've missed," Sarah said, her mind racing. "Something Cartwright's going to use against us." The next day, they drove to a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of the city where Matthews had arranged the drop. It was a risky move, meeting in a place like this, away from prying eyes. But it was the only way they could ensure the evidence would reach the right hands without Cartwright getting wind of it. Sarah kept her eyes on the rearview mirror, scanning the streets for any signs of followers, but the road was empty. It felt too quiet. Lena sat in the back seat, clutching a duffel bag filled with the evidence, her face pale but determined. "I just want this over," she said quietly. "I want to be free." "We all do," Sarah replied, her voice tight with tension. Matthews's message had been clear: be careful. The people you trust may not be who they say they are. The thought lingered in Sarah's mind as they approached the warehouse. Was there someone on the inside who had been feeding Cartwright information? Were they walking into a trap? As they entered the warehouse, Matthews was waiting in a shadowed corner, looking every bit the seasoned detective he was. His face was tight, his eyes scanning the room nervously. He nodded when he saw them, his expression unreadable. "We've got a problem," Matthews said immediately. "I don't trust anyone at this point. The guy I was supposed to meet, the one I thought was clean, he's not answering his phone. We've got a leak somewhere." Sarah's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Cartwright's people are probably already on their way. I'm going to give this a few more minutes, but if we don't hear from him soon, we need to get out of here." The clock was ticking. Each passing second felt like it could be their last. Sarah's heart raced as she kept scanning the shadows, waiting for any sign of movement. Reynolds stood beside her, his posture tense, ready for anything. Just as Matthews began to turn to leave, the warehouse doors creaked open. A man in a dark coat stepped inside, his face obscured by the dim light. Sarah's instincts flared. This was it, the moment that could make or break everything. "Matthews," the man said in a gravelly voice, his tone far too casual for the situation. "I thought you'd be here." Matthews's eyes hardened. "You're late." The man shrugged. "Cartwright's boys keep things running behind schedule. You know how it is." Sarah's eyes flicked between Matthews and the man. Something wasn't right. "Who are you?" she asked sharply, stepping forward. The man glanced at Sarah, then back at Matthews. "You don't need to worry about who I am. I'm the one with the connections you need." Matthews looked at him suspiciously but said nothing. He handed the man a folder with the final piece of evidence. "This is everything. Take it and make sure it gets to the right people." The man glanced at the folder, then back at Matthews. "I'll take care of it. You've got my word." But before Matthews could respond, a loud crash echoed through the building. The lights flickered. and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Someone had just breached the warehouse. "Get down," Matthews shouted, shoving Sarah to the ground as gunshots rang out. Chaos erupted around them as they scrambled for cover. The man who had taken the folder dove behind a stack of crates, drawing his gun. "You didn't think Cartwright wouldn't find out, did you?" he yelled, his voice tinged with amusement. Reynolds grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward a side exit. "We've got to move now." But it was already too late. The door behind them slammed open, and armed men flooded into the warehouse, weapons raised. They had been outflanked. Cartwright had made his move, and they had walked right into his trap. The next moments felt like a blur. Gunfire, shouting, and chaos filled the air as Sarah and the others fought to stay alive. Matthews's voice was barely audible above the noise. "Get to the car. Go." They ran through the warehouse, dodging bullets and making their way toward the exit. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. They reached the car, but as Sarah tried to jump in, she felt a sharp pain in her side. She stumbled, falling to her knees. Reynolds was already by her side, helping her into the vehicle. "We need to go," Reynolds said urgently, his voice full of panic. Sarah barely had time to register what had happened before the car sped off, the sound of sirens wailing in the distance. She glanced out the window, her body trembling, and realized just how close they had come to losing everything. As they drove away, Sarah looked at the team, her heart heavy with fear. They had made it out, but Cartwright wasn't finished. He'd made his move, and now the stakes were higher than ever. They hadn't just been exposed, they were running for their lives. And Cartwright would stop at nothing until they were all dead. The adrenaline of the escape slowly wore off, leaving Sarah feeling hollow. Her side throbbed with pain from the bullet graze, but it was the weight of the failure that hurt most. They had come so close, and yet, in a single, deadly move, Cartwright had turned the tables. The evidence they had worked so hard to collect was now in his hands, and he was going to use it to bury them. To bury everything. The car sped through the dark streets, the sound of tires screeching against the pavement breaking through the silence in the back seat. Matthews's grip on the wheel was tight, his knuckles white. The tension was thick in the air. The only sound in the car was the hum of the engine and the quick, shallow breaths of the team. Reynolds kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, his fingers tapping nervously on the dashboard. "We need a new plan," he muttered, as though he was saying it to himself more than anyone else. Sarah glanced out the window, her mind whirling. She should have seen it coming. She should have known the risk. But Cartwright was always one step ahead. She didn't know how, but he was. And now they were running out of time. "We can't just keep running," Sarah said, her voice sharp. "We need to hit him back. We need to turn this around before it's too late." Matthews glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "And how do you propose we do that, Sarah? He's got everything we were working for. He has people everywhere, and now he's on to us." "I don't care," Sarah said through gritted teeth. "We find a way. We have to. If we let him win, we're no better than him." Reynolds turned around to face her. "And you've got a plan for that? Because running isn't going to solve anything. We can't just keep playing defense." Sarah's mind was working furiously. She had no solid plan, but she couldn't give up. Not now. Not when they were so close. Cartwright may have the evidence, but they had something he didn't, each other. Matthews, Reynolds, Lena, and her. They weren't just a team. They were a family now, bound together by their mission and their shared determination to see this through. "We need leverage," Sarah said, finally forming a thought. "Something Cartwright can't ignore. We need to expose him, and we need to do it in a way that makes him afraid." Matthews's eyes narrowed. "Expose him? How? He has everything on us." "I'm talking about his weaknesses," Sarah replied. "The people who depend on him. The people he's been manipulating for years. The public won't stand for it if they know what he's really been doing." "We could go public," Reynolds said, his voice hesitant. "But Cartwright's network is too deep. If we do that, we might be signing our own death warrants." "We can't just sit here and do nothing," Sarah insisted. "We have to play offense. If we bring the right people in, people who can't be bought, then we might have a shot at this." Lena, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up. Her voice was steady but serious. We can't trust anyone in the system anymore. Not after everything that's happened. We need to find a way to expose Cartwright without him seeing us coming. Sarah looked over at her. I agree. We need to act fast and think smart. The silence in the car was suffocating as they thought through the options. It felt as though the weight of the world was pressing down on them. Every decision, every move, could either be their last or the key to taking down Cartwright once and for all. Hours later, they had made it to a safe house, a place Matthews had arranged in case things went sideways. It was isolated, tucked away in the middle of nowhere, far from the prying eyes of Cartwright's network. Matthews had pulled some strings to secure the place, and they would have to lay low for a while. But it wasn't enough to simply hide. They couldn't afford to be passive. As the team gathered around the small kitchen table, Sarah laid out a new plan. It was risky, but it was their only option. We're going to have to go straight to the top, Sarah said. The people in charge, those who can't be manipulated. We'll take what we know to the media, but we'll do it through sources that Cartwright can't control. It'll be our word against his, but if we have the right allies, we might just make it stick. And who exactly do you have in mind for these allies? Matthews asked, skeptical but willing to listen. There's a journalist, Sarah said, her voice calm but with a quiet resolve. Her name's Emily Carter. She's been investigating Cartwright for years. We've crossed paths a couple of times in the past. She's got the kind of influence we need. Someone who isn't afraid to dig deep, even when the odds are stacked against her. And you trust her? Reynolds asked. Sarah hesitated for a moment. As much as I can trust anyone these days. She's been burned by the system, too. But we can't afford to take chances. She'll want proof, and that's why we need to get the evidence back. Lena spoke up. And how are we going to do that? We don't even know where Cartwright is right now. He could be anywhere. We'll have to get creative, Sarah said, her voice filled with determination. We know Cartwright's weaknesses. He's careful, but he's not invincible. He'll slip up, and when he does, we'll be ready to strike. The days that followed were a whirlwind of planning, hiding, and gathering intel. Sarah reached out to Emily, carefully laying the groundwork for their meeting. They couldn't afford to meet in person. Cartwright's people were everywhere, but they could communicate through secure channels. Emily was hesitant at first, but after Sarah sent her a snippet of the information they had on Cartwright, Emily was all in. It was a delicate dance, one that involved covert messages, secret meetings, and the careful assembling of proof. They couldn't go public yet, not until they were sure the story would be heard, and heard by the right people. Finally, the moment arrived. The team had gathered everything they could, and Emily was ready to take the story to the media. She'd done her part. Now, it was time for Sarah and the team to make their final move. The news broke just hours later. A detailed expose. The truth about Cartwright's empire. The corruption, the payoffs, the crimes, was all laid bare for the world to see. Cartwright was exposed, and the fallout was immediate. Arrests began, investigations were launched, and the media storm that followed rocked the very foundation of the power structure Cartwright had built. But Sarah knew this wasn't the end. It wasn't just about taking Cartwright down. It was about fixing the system he had corrupted. And that would take more than just one story. It would take an entire movement. As she watched the coverage unfold, Sarah felt a sense of relief. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, and she wasn't naive enough to think that Cartwright wouldn't retaliate. But for now, they had struck a blow. And that was enough. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?